Tonight, I want to tell you about an alternate history that lives in the shadow of one of the most iconic stories ever told. What would have happened if Scar, the villain of The Lion King, had chosen differently on the night he killed his brother, and had raised his brother's son as his own instead of ordering him put to death? It's a question that sounds simple at first, but the more you sit with it, the more you realize it reaches into almost every corner of the story and reshapes it entirely. Because this is not a story about redemption, or about someone being secretly good all along. This is a story about a man who made a choice in the dark that seemed merciful in the moment, and then spent the next years discovering what the true cost of that choice would be. So let me take you back to the night it happened, to the gorge in the Pride Lands, where everything turned on a single decision in the chaos and the blood. Let me start by telling you about Scar, or Taka, as his mother knew him, before the scar over his left eye gave him a name that felt more true than the one he was born with. He was the younger brother of Mufasa, the king, and that single fact shaped everything about him. Mufasa was born to rule, broad-shouldered, golden-maned, with the kind of natural authority that seemed to pour out of him without effort, the way starlight pours out of a star. Scar was born into the same family and inherited the same bloodline, and it was never quite enough. He was intelligent in a way that Mufasa was not, cunning, patient, capable of seeing moves 3 or 4 steps ahead where his brother saw only the immediate moment. But intelligence and ambition are two very different things from the ability to command, and Scar had long ago accepted that the throne would never be his by right of birth or by the kind of love and trust that the pride naturally offered to Mufasa. So he had hatched a plan, methodical and careful, that had taken months to arrange. He had befriended the hyenas, Shenzi, Banzai and Ed, creatures who lived on the borderlands of the Pride Lands, who were hungry and angry and desperate for a chance to hunt in territory where prey was plentiful. He had made them a promise, help him, and when he was king, they would hunt where they wanted, feed where they wanted, and the vast territories of the Pride Lands would be open to them. The mechanics of it were almost elegant in their simplicity. On a chosen night, the hyenas would trigger a stampede of wildebeest in the gorge, a narrow, treacherous place where the animals panic and surge without control, where the cliffs are high and the footing is uncertain. Mufasa would come to rescue whoever was in danger, because that was what Mufasa did. He had spent his entire reign believing that a king's duty was to his subjects, to the weak, to those who could not save themselves. And Simba, Mufasa's son, the young heir to the throne, would be the bait. Scar had lured the cub to the gorge that afternoon under the guise of a surprise, a secret thing between uncle and nephew. He had told the boy to wait in the gorge, to practice his roar, to be patient and brave, to show his father how much he had grown. Then he had disappeared and left Simba alone in the dark as the sound of the stampede began to build in the distance like thunder rolling in across the plains. We know how it ended. Mufasa came, as Scar had known he would, and he pulled his son to safety, the great king moving through the chaos with a kind of strength and grace that seemed to belong to no ordinary creature. But Scar was waiting, and in the moment when Mufasa was focused entirely on saving the cub, exhausted and off balance, Scar struck. He had driven his brother off the ledge, back into the stampede, back into the crushing weight of the herd, and Mufasa had died there in the dust and chaos, the king brought down by the very creatures his pride depended on, destroyed from within by his own family. The words Scar had spoken in that moment, "Long live the king," were his own epitaph as well as his claim, a complete and perfect statement of what he believed the world to be. A place where only the strongest, the most willing to be cruel, the most patient in their plotting, were allowed to survive. And then it was done. The stampede passed, the dust settled, and Simba, small and terrified and covered in ash, found himself standing over his father's body in the darkness with his uncle beside him, the very same uncle who had orchestrated everything. This is where I want you to pay attention, because this is the moment. Scar could have simply finished what he had started. He could have left the hyenas to do their work. He had already commanded them to kill the boy, to make sure there was no heir, no rival, no one to question his right to sit on the throne. The cub was already traumatized, already broken by grief, already destroyed by the belief that he himself was responsible for his father's death, a belief that Scar had carefully implanted in his mind in those last moments before the stampede. A few minutes more, and Simba would be dead, and no one at Pride Rock would ever know the truth. But Scar did not leave him to the hyenas. Instead, something happened in that moment, something that is never quite clear, even now, whether it was a moment of weakness or cruelty taking a new and more interesting form, or something else entirely that moved beneath the surface of his thinking. He looked at the boy, small and golden and desolate, and instead of letting the hyenas finish their work, he sent them away. He kept Simba. I don't know what he told himself about it in those first moments. Perhaps he told himself that a dead heir was useless, but a hidden one might still be valuable, a secret that no one could ever prove, an heir that everyone believed was dead but whom Scar alone knew still lived, a way to hold power by the simple fact that he knew something no one else in the Pride did. Perhaps he told himself that the boy was a curiosity, a prize, something beautiful and broken that deserved to be possessed rather than simply destroyed. Perhaps he told himself nothing at all and simply made a choice in the darkness, and only later began constructing reasons why it made sense. But he made the choice, and it changed everything. He returned to Pride Rock that night and announced to the Pride that both Mufasa and Simba were dead, lost to the stampede, taken from them in a moment of chaos that no one could have predicted or prevented. His voice when he made the announcement was heavy with grief, weighted with the proper kind of sorrow, the kind of sorrow that a king should feel when his brother and his nephew are taken from him. And the Pride believed him because they wanted to believe him, because they were in shock and pain and leaderless, and Scar was there, and he spoke with certainty. He declared himself king that very night, and when the hyenas came with him, when the balance of power at Pride Rock began to shift in subtle and terrible ways, the Pride was too grief-struck and too accustomed to obeying authority to question it. But somewhere in the chambers beneath Pride Rock, in the hidden places where no one went, Scar had kept Simba, small and traumatized and completely, utterly dependent on his uncle for food and shelter and the most basic conditions of survival. And the boy would stay there, in those hidden places, for a very long time. This is where our story truly begins, not with the murder of a king, which was meant to be the final thing, the definitive end to any threat to Scar's power, but with a choice that created, instead, a different kind of story entirely. A story about what happens when a predator decides that the thing he wanted to destroy might be more useful alive than dead, and about the cost of that discovery, paid in full by both of them, over years that neither of them could have imagined on that night in the gorge when the choice was made in the dark. As the first light breaks across the Pride lands, the sun rises on a kingdom that does not yet know it has been murdered in the dark. Scar climbs back up through the gorge alone, his dark fur still dust-heavy from the stampede, and there is blood on his claws that is not his own. The cub, small, broken, barely breathing, is cradled against his chest as he moves through the narrow passages that wind beneath Pride Rock, away from the eyes of the Pride waking above. He does not question why he has done this. He has learned long ago that some choices live in the body before they reach the mind, and this is one of them. The private den he chooses is deep in the stone, where the light comes only from the crack gaps in the rock face, and the air smells of minerals and ancient damp. He lays Simba down on a bed of dry grass he prepares with surprising care, noting the cub's shallow breathing, the tremors that run through his small frame. The little one does not wake, whether from shock or injury or something deeper, Scar cannot yet say, and there is a strange weight in his chest when he considers it. By the time Scar emerges into the main Pride cavern, the lionesses are already awake, already restless with the wrong feeling of the morning, the smell of blood and dust, the absence of the king's voice calling the Pride to order. Sarabi stands at the entrance to her chamber, her eyes still carrying the calm of sleep, but there is something in her posture that suggests she knows already that the world has shifted. She looks at Scar and asks where her mate is and where her son is, and her voice does not rise. It remains steady and queenly, but there is a terrible knowledge in it. Scar does not flinch. He has rehearsed this moment 100 times in the dark hours before dawn, and the words come as naturally as breathing. Both of them died in the stampede, he tells her, and there is genuine sorrow in his voice, because some of what he says is true. Mufasa is certainly dead, scattered in dust at the bottom of the gorge. He did not manage to save them. He continues, and the regret sounds authentic because he has spent a lifetime perfecting the art of making lies sound like confessions. The stampede was sudden, he explains. He could not have predicted it, could not have stopped it, could only watch as the herd churned everything beneath it into silence. Sarabi's face does not change, but he sees her claws flex against the stone, sees the moment when denial tries to take hold, and then shatters. Nala comes forward from the cluster of younger lions, her small voice asking if Simba is truly gone, and there is something in the way she asks it, some animal certainty, that makes Scar meet her eyes directly and hold them. Yes, he says quietly, and he watches to see if she believes him. She does, or at least she chooses to, which is the same thing in the moment. She is too young still to understand the difference between the two. By midday, the Pride gathers at the promontory, and Scar makes his ascent to the place where a king stands when he addresses his people. He speaks of duty and of loss, of the fragility of life in the circle, of the way the great tree turns and sometimes takes even the precious ones. The lionesses listen, and some of them weep, and some of them look at him with something that might become anger if they had the courage to let it. But they do not. They are used to accepting what comes, and Scar's voice carries the weight of inevitability. He announces himself as king with a simplicity that admits no question. There is no election, no challenge, no moment in which another voice might have risen. It is simply done, the way the sun simply rises, as if it could have been no other way. Below, in the hidden dark, Simba stirs for the first time since Scar laid him down, and his eyes open without understanding. The cub makes a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a cry, and it echoes in the stone chamber like a ghost of something that should not exist. Scar, when he returns to the den in the evening, brings with him a haunch of meat fresh killed, and he watches as the cub's instinct overcomes his trauma and he eats, trembling. There is something almost tender in the way Scar's claws rest on Simba's small head as he feeds, but tenderness and cruelty are not opposites in this moment. They are simply two sides of the same act. The cub does not know who he is yet, or where he is, or what has happened to him, and Scar does not tell him. He simply remains, a presence in the darkness, solid and warm and utterly in control. Above, in the main cavern, the Pride settles into an uneasy sleep, and the first night of a new reign passes without incident. But there is an animal knowing among them, a sense that something essential has been broken, that the circle itself has been thrown out of balance. Zazu, the majordomo, has already begun to ask inconvenient questions, already begun to smell the deception in the air, and Scar has already decided what must be done about him. The hyenas, meanwhile, are celebrating at the borders of the Pride lands, already tasting the herds that have been promised to them, already beginning to move in, to consume, to change the character of the kingdom with their hunger. Somewhere in the deep places of the Pride, in the hidden chambers carved by time and stone, a secret begins to take root. It is small and fragile and entirely dependent on Scar's whim, and it will grow in the dark for years to come, unseen by everyone but him. There is no way out of this, not anymore, not for the cub, and perhaps not for Scar either. The choice he made in the dark at the bottom of the gorge has planted something that neither of them will be able to stop from flowering. And as the night deepens and the first full day of his reign settles into history, Scar lies awake in his own chamber, listening to the breathing of the kingdom he has taken, and wondering, for perhaps the first time, what he has truly done. The dawn after Simba's disappearance, Scar stood in the great stone chamber, Mufasa's chamber, and looked at the throne as if seeing it for the first time. It was a curious thing to notice, but the stone seemed smaller than he had always imagined it, now that he was standing beside it rather than standing below. He had spent years looking up at his brother seated there, feeling the weight of that distance. The way Mufasa's frame seemed to fill the space with an authority that came not from the chair itself, but from something else entirely, something Scar had never quite managed to name. Now he lowered himself onto the stone, and the chamber did not rearrange itself around him the way it had for Mufasa. The light from the entrance fell in the same way, fell on him in a way that made the scar on his face catch and shadow alternately, made him look, he thought, older, more lined. But he was the king now. That was the fact that mattered, and facts, Scar had always believed, were what the world was made of. Below him, 3 flights of descending stone, in a den so deep the air itself seemed old, Simba had stopped screaming. Scar did not think about this often, and when he did, he thought of it practically. The cub would need feeding, would need water, would eventually either break or become useful. One or the other. He turned his mind away from the chamber beneath, and toward the pride gathering on the stone floor below the promontory, where dawn was making the sparse grass look almost golden in a way that was already becoming misleading. By dusk, Scar had invited the hyenas to come to the Pride lands, and by the time the sun set that first day, their laughter was audible from everywhere at once, a sound like no sound the kingdom had ever heard. You could hear them in the northern plains, in the western ravines, coming from the shadows of the acacia trees and the limestone ridges, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and the older lionesses of the Pride exchanged glances that said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. Shenzi, who led them, was a compact thing, lean and clever, and she walked with Scar from the promontory to the hunting grounds as if she and the king had come to an understanding that needed no further discussion. The other 2, Banzai and Ed, came behind her with the peculiar gait hyenas had, slightly slouched, always seeming to be about to laugh. Scar showed them the herds, the wildebeest, the zebra, the gazelle, all of them still abundant in those first days, still moving in the patterns they had always moved in. He told them they could hunt as they wished, take what they needed, that the Pride lands existed now to feed them as repayment for their loyalty, for the muscle that had made his coronation certain. Shenzi listened with her head tilted slightly, a predator's gesture, and when Scar finished, she simply nodded once and turned away to begin organizing her clans, divisions forming with a speed and efficiency that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this opening for a long time. Within weeks, the herds began to thin visibly. Within 2 months, the wildebeest moved elsewhere, sensing something in the land had changed. Some balance had shifted toward hunger and away from safety. The gazelle followed, and the zebra, and suddenly the Pride lands looked the way a bone looks after the meat has been stripped from it, recognizable in its form but drained of what made it living. Sarabi watched this from her position at the margins of the Pride, and there was nothing she could do but watch, because Scar's voice had taken on a pitch that did not invite contradiction, and the hyenas were everywhere now, perched on the rocks at the Pride's periphery, their eyes never quite closed, never quite looking away. One evening, a week or so into his reign, Scar found her watching the sunset from an outcrop, and he climbed up to stand beside her with an ease that suggested he was not at all aware of how his presence made the stone feel smaller. He told her the land was changing, that Mufasa's way had been gentle but ineffective, that a new order required strength that she had perhaps not realized the kingdom needed. He told her he hoped she would see the wisdom in what he was building. His voice had a quality in it that was almost reasonable, almost kind, and Sarabi turned to him with eyes that held a knowledge he could not quite read, and she said nothing, which was perhaps the most frightening response possible. For Scar had not yet learned that there is a kind of silence that is not submission at all, but refusal, and that the quietest resistance is often the one that cuts deepest. In Mufasa's old cave, where the throne sat, Scar began to spend his evenings alone, looking at the stone walls that held the history of the kingdom in patterns of light and shadow, and he would think about the throne beneath him and whether it felt any different when you sat on it without questioning your right to do so. Zazu, the old hornbill, was given a cage made from the ribs of a long-dead creature, and when Scar wanted entertainment, he would summon the bird and demand that he sing, and Zazu would sing old songs about Mufasa, careful never to name the previous king directly because Scar had forbidden that name to be spoken, had declared that the old order was erased, that this was the beginning of something new. But forbidding a name does not unmake the absence it describes, and the lionesses continued to feel the weight of Mufasa's missing presence like a constant pressure in the air, a thing that gave shape and meaning to all the changes happening around them. Nala was young enough that she mostly accepted what had happened, the way a cub accepts the world it finds itself in, but even she sensed that something had fundamentally broken in the day of the stampede, that the kingdom she had been born into had quietly become a different thing. By the end of the 3rd month, the transformation was nearly complete. The bones at the base of Pride Rock were numerous enough now that you could build patterns from them, and the sky had taken on a perpetual haze of dust that made every sunset look like something was burning, or had already burned, or was about to burn, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop the burning because the burning was the government now. It was the law, it was the way things worked under Taka, whom everyone was learning to call Scar with a deference that felt less like respect and more like fear. And below, in the dark chambers, Simba slept and woke and did not yet understand what had happened to him, did not yet know that the person feeding him, the only face he could almost recognize, the only voice he could hear in the darkness, was the same person who had destroyed everything he had been before that night when the ground began to move. In the beginning of his captivity, Simba does not know that he is captive because he does not know what he is at all. He opens his eyes in absolute darkness, the kind of darkness you only find very deep underground, where light has never reached and the air tastes of stone and stillness and his own small breath. There is pain everywhere in his body, his legs, his ribs, the left side of his face where he struck the rocks as the stampede bore him down and down until he was nothing but a body tumbling through noise and dust and the weight of 10,000 hooves. He tries to call for his father, but his voice does not come. There is only a whisper, a sound like wind through a canyon, and then even that effort leaves him gasping, because breathing hurts. Time moves differently in absolute darkness, and Simba has no measure of how long he lies there on the cool stone floor, drifting in and out of something that is not quite sleep, not quite consciousness, a kind of half-drowning in his own shock and pain. When he finally hears the sound of claws on stone, drawing closer, he does not feel fear at first. He feels only a thin, desperate hope. Perhaps it is his father, coming to find him. Perhaps his father is not dead, despite the screaming, despite the falling, despite the way everything went red and then black. The shape that enters is enormous, a dark blur against the grey nothing, and as his eyes begin to focus, he recognizes the scarred face, the cold amber eyes, the uncle he has known only from a distance, always at the far end of a room, always with that peculiar smile that never reached anything genuine. Scar carries something in his mouth, a piece of fresh kill, still warm, small enough for a cub's hunger. He sets it down on the stone, and even through the agony of his body, Simba's instinct is to move toward it, to eat. There is no judgment in hunger. It simply is, and survival is older and louder than any other thing the mind might understand. When Simba tries to move, his legs do not obey him properly. One hind leg buckles and he collapses, but the meat is so close, and his mouth is so dry, and he pulls himself forward on his forelegs like an animal learning to be born. Scar watches, and there is something almost clinical in the way he observes, as if he is watching an experiment unfold, a thing he has placed into motion and now intends to understand completely. The cub eats because the cub must eat, and when his belly is no longer empty, the pain in his body seems almost bearable, almost distant. He looks up at Scar, still without understanding, and Scar's mouth curves into something that resembles comfort, though nothing in it is warm. "You are confused, I know," Scar says, and his voice is the carefully gentle tone of someone speaking to something very small and very broken. "That is natural. You have had a terrible ordeal." Simba's mind reaches backward through the darkness, trying to grasp the shape of what happened, and he finds only fragments. The weight of the stampede, his father's roar, a feeling of falling, and underneath it all, a sensation he cannot name yet, but will name eventually, the sensation of being betrayed by the ground itself. "Your father," Scar continues, moving closer, and now his voice carries a kind of sorrowful certainty, the tone of someone bringing terrible news, "did not survive. The stampede was too much. Even a king cannot stand against such a force." Simba makes a sound, not quite a roar, not quite a whimper, and something in him fractures further, though he does not understand why. He has been too young to fully comprehend death, but he understands now, in the way a body understands falling, and the pain of that understanding is worse than any physical hurt. "But you," Scar says, and now there is something almost tender in the way he looks at the cub, something that might fool someone who did not know what it was, which is simply attention, the terrible focus of someone who has decided that you matter precisely because you are his to control. "You survived. Against all odds, you are still here, still alive." The cub wants this to mean something good, wants to understand this as rescue, as love, as the uncle who has kept him breathing when everything else died. He does not yet know that these chambers have no other entrance, that the smooth stone walls admit no light from the world above, that even his own voice cannot reach the pride that mourns him, or rather, the pride that does not mourn him, because they have already stopped believing he exists. "Why?" Simba asks, though the word barely escapes his throat, and in that single syllable is every question a young thing asks when the world has stopped making sense. "Why did it happen? Why did I survive? Why are you here? Why?" Scar settles onto the stone floor a short distance away, his tail coiling around himself with the ease of someone accustomed to power, and he begins to speak in the low, careful voice of a parent explaining something important to a child. "There was an accident," he says, and the word accident sits in the darkness like a lie wrapped in truth, both of which Simba is too young and too shattered to distinguish. "The stampede came too fast. Your father tried to protect you. He called to you to climb. Do you remember?" And here, in the architecture of this moment, Scar plants a seed. Simba does remember. A roar, a command, the shape of his father's voice calling him toward the rocks, and his own small body scrambling, trying, failing to find purchase against the slope. He remembers his father's face in the dust, and in his confusion and grief, he cannot be certain whether the fault lies with the stampede or with something else entirely. "You tried so hard to reach safety," Scar continues, his voice never wavering. "I watched you try, but you were so small and the stampede was so large, and your father made a choice in that moment." The scar over Scar's left eye catches what little light exists in this place, and it seems to gleam. "A choice," Simba whispers. "He put himself between you and the danger," Scar says, and this part is true, but the way it is framed is a masterwork of destruction. He gave his life so that you might live, and in doing so, he became a casualty of his own nobility. He became a victim of a force he could not control. Simba does not yet understand that he is being lied to, that his uncle is selecting details the way a hunter selects which part of the prey to take, leaving the rest for the scavengers. He understands only that his father is gone, that he is in pain, that he is alive only because his uncle has chosen to keep him alive, and that survival itself may be the heaviest burden of all. The cub curls up on the cold stone, exhaustion and shock pulling him back toward that half-drowning sleep, and Scar remains, watching the small broken thing in the dark, already beginning the long, patient work of making it his. Above, in the pride, they have already mourned him and moved on. Below, in the chambers, the real work has only just begun. In those early weeks, as Simba lay in the darkness beneath Pride Rock, Scar came to him not as a captor, but as the only voice that could penetrate the fog of trauma and hunger that had become the cub's entire world. The killing stroke at the gorge, Scar's claws at Mufasa's back, that whispered, "Long live the king," Simba had not witnessed, and in that gap between what he saw and what he did not, Scar would plant everything. You understand, I think, that memory in a child is not a perfect thing. It is fragmentary, shaped by emotion and repetition, vulnerable to revision by a voice that speaks with certainty and control food. Simba remembered the roar, his own roar, which he had practiced in secret, proud and foolish, and in his fractured recollection, he had convinced himself that his voice had started the stampede. Scar would sit beside the cub in the dark, and he would speak softly, the way a father might, and he would say, "Do you remember what happened, little one? Do you remember what your roar did?" The cub's mind, desperate for a narrative that made sense of the senseless, would grasp at this explanation like a drowning creature reaching for a branch. There is something deeply cruel about using a child's own guilt as the hinge on which to turn him. It is a cruelty that requires patience and understanding, and Scar possessed both in abundance. Taka, for that was his true name, a word meaning dirt or want, had lived his entire life in the shadow of his older brother, watching Mufasa receive what should have been his, crowned with affection and certainty and the promise of the future. His facial scar, a jagged thing across his eye, had come from a buffalo in an encounter orchestrated by hyenas years before, a reminder of his own powerlessness, his own capacity to be used and discarded by those he thought beneath him. Now, in the dark beneath the rock, he held the power to reshape a mind that was still forming, and he moved through this work with the precision of someone who had studied manipulation as an art. "Your father tried to save you," Scar would say, his voice warm and understanding, "and in saving you, he stepped into the path of the herd. Do you see? You were the reason he had to be brave." He did not say, "I threw him into the gorge while the wildebeest tore him apart. I made the hyenas start the stampede. I walked you into that gorge on purpose, little heir." Instead, he offered a frame in which Simba's guilt was earned, in which his father's death was not murder but sacrifice, which is somehow a more insidious thing because it transformed the crime into a proof of love. The cub was utterly dependent, you understand, dependent for water, for the meat Scar brought him, for any voice in the darkness that was not the sound of his own breathing and terror. There is no persuasion quite like hunger. There is no argument quite so convincing as the removal of food followed by its return. Scar would withhold the meal, and Simba's small body would ache with want, and then Scar would return with fresh kill, and the cub would eat from his uncle's claws, and in that moment of relief, of survival, a kind of twisted affection would form. This is the mechanism of what we might call the scorpion's embrace. You wound something, you become the only relief from the wound, and in time the wounded creature cannot distinguish between the harm and the help. Scar spoke to Simba of the pride, of how the rules that Mufasa had taught were too rigid, too cruel, too demanding of a young lion who had never asked to carry a kingdom on his shoulders. "Your father believed you had to be strong," Scar would say, "but strength is not what you need right now, is it? What you need is someone who understands." He painted himself as the merciful one, the uncle who saw his nephew's pain and responded not with lessons or demands, but with care, with presence, with the gift of being truly known. This was perhaps the deepest inversion. Scar had murdered Mufasa, and now he repositioned himself as the alternative to Mufasa, as the one who would not demand, who would not judge, who would not make his heir prove his worthiness through trial and sacrifice. Above ground, the Pride was learning a new order, one in which the hyenas roamed freely, and the herds were thinning week by week, and the ancient laws that had kept the circle of life in balance were beginning to fray. But in the darkness, in the private chamber that no one in the Pride knew existed, a different kind of unraveling was taking place, slower, more intimate, and in some ways more complete. Simba's memories were beginning to shift. The hard edges of what he had witnessed were softening under the weight of Scar's repeated narratives, and the simple, overwhelming fact of his uncle's presence as the sole agent of his survival. I find myself thinking about what it means to be a child in that position, to have witnessed catastrophe, to carry genuine guilt for something you did not cause, and to have that guilt taken up by someone you are biologically drawn to trust, someone whose voice carries the weight of authority and blood. The truth, the actual truth, that Mufasa had been thrown, that the stampede was orchestrated, that Simba had been walked into a trap, was becoming less real to the cub than the story Scar was telling, because the story was repeated, and the story provided an explanation, and the story came from the mouth of the only person who loved him. This is what psychological manipulation does. It does not erase memory so much as reframe it, until the original memory becomes unreliable in the mind of the one who lived it. Scar was careful in these early weeks not to position himself as blameless. Instead, he suggested, gently, that perhaps they shared in this responsibility, that perhaps they were both caught in something larger than either of them. I could not save him either, he would tell Simba, and there was a kind of truth in that statement, if you understood it correctly, a truth wrapped around a monumental lie, the way a scorpion wraps itself around a creature to deliver its sting. By the 8th week, Simba no longer asked why he could not leave the chamber, no longer questioned whether the world he remembered was real or dream, no longer wondered if his uncle might be something other than the merciful caregiver he had come to depend upon. The boy was being remade slowly in the dark, by the steady application of guilt and food and the only love available to him, and Scar, who had lived so long in want, in the shadow of his brother, in the pain of his scar, finally held something that was entirely his to shape. The circle of life, that great teaching Mufasa had given, was being inverted. Instead of a cycle of balance and acceptance, it was becoming a cycle of control, in which Simba would learn that survival itself depended on accepting the story his captor told, on internalizing the guilt that bound them, on becoming not the heir Mufasa had raised, but the broken, dependent thing that Scar had decided he would be. By the 3rd month of his reign, Scar had begun to think of his hidden chambers not as a prison, but as a classroom, and the boy growing in darkness below the stone as his greatest work of art. In the months that follow the first raw confrontations, something quiet and terrible happens in the darkness beneath Pride Rock, something almost too slow to notice while it is occurring. Simba's memories of the night in the gorge, once sharp and undeniable, begin to soften at the edges, like a stone worn smooth by water over seasons. He still recalls his father falling, still recalls Scar's face at the cliff edge, still recalls the terrible weight of the accusation. You did this. But the order of those moments begins to shift in his mind, the sequence blurring. Did he roar before or after the stampede began? He cannot quite remember. Did his father enter the gorge to save him, or did he push Mufasa into it? The distinction, once clear as light, becomes obscured, and when Simba tries to hold it still in his mind, it slips away. Scar does not force this forgetting. He does not need to. He simply speaks, with infinite patience, and speaks again, and speaks yet again, until the repetition itself becomes a kind of truth. That is the art of it. The boy asks, sometimes, whether things happen the way he remembers them. Scar listens to these questions with what appears to be genuine concern, and then he gently, almost tenderly, offers an alternative. Your father was proud, cub, too proud to let anyone help him, even his own son. Can you imagine how that must have felt, to be so strong that you could not admit when you needed protection? Or you roared because you were frightened, and who could blame you for that? The stampede was already in motion. Your small voice could not have caused it. What caused it was your father's insistence on running into danger to prove himself still strong. These are not lies, exactly, or they do not feel like lies in the telling. They feel like reframings, like someone pointing out details Simba had overlooked, like a more complete understanding of what already happened. In the darkness, with no one else to verify the truth, with only Scar's voice and Scar's patience, and the food Scar provides when the cub has done well, the reframings begin to feel like kindness. By month 7 of his captivity, Simba has stopped asking whether his memories are correct. He has begun, instead, to trust Scar's version of them, the way a child trusts a parent to remember childhood correctly, because the parent was there, and the child was small and confused. Except Scar was there in a way Simba is only now beginning to understand. Scar was there at the cliff edge. Scar saw everything. Scar would know the truth better than Simba himself. This is the beauty of it, from Scar's perspective. The boy is being remade not through force, but through the simple, patient replacement of one narrative with another, until the false version becomes the only version Simba can access. There is a moment in month 8 when Simba asks Scar directly, "Did I kill my father?" And Scar could say yes, could cement the full weight of that guilt, could use it as the final pillar of control. But instead, Scar says something more subtle, more devastating. You were not strong enough to save him, and that is not the same thing. You were a cub, terrified, doing what any frightened child would do. Your father loved you, and that love made him reckless. He chose to run into danger to protect you, and the danger was greater than his strength. That was not your fault, Simba. That was simply the cost of being loved by someone as proud as Mufasa. When Scar says this, with genuine seeming warmth, with a paw on the boy's shoulder, Simba weeps. He is weeping not because he believes he killed his father, but because he has come to understand, or believes he has come to understand, that he was loved in a way that destroyed the one who loved him. That understanding is in some ways crueler than the original accusation. It takes guilt and wraps it in tenderness. It makes the boy feel, paradoxically, both less responsible and more broken. Above ground, during these same months, the Pride lands continue their slow collapse under Scar's rule. The herds have thinned to near nothing. The lionesses hunt hyena kills or go hungry. The grass does not grow. Scar walks among them in his new position, offering explanations, shaping the narrative of loss and scarcity into a story about the necessity of his own harsh rule. The times are difficult, he says, and difficult times require a different kind of king than Mufasa was. Mufasa believed in balance and responsibility. I believe in survival. Some of the Pride remember differently, remember hunts where the land provided, remember a king whose strength lay in understanding rather than domination. But those memories grow harder to hold when your ribs are visible beneath your fur and your cubs cry from hunger. And Scar has made it clear that speaking Mufasa's name in his presence invites consequences. So the memories stay private, tucked away, losing their power with each generation that is born into scarcity and knows nothing else. In the hidden den, Simba does not know any of this. He does not know about the collapsing herds or the weakening pride, or the hyenas spreading through his homeland like a plague. His entire world is the stone chamber, the occasional journey beyond it under Scar's guidance, and the voice of his uncle, which has become the voice of truth and law, and the only love he has ever known in a clear, unambiguous way. Because that is the other thing Scar has done, so carefully, so methodically. He has made himself the sole source of approval and affection in the boy's world. When Simba asks questions, Scar listens. When Simba has nightmares about falling, Scar comforts him. When Simba succeeds at the tasks Scar sets for him, running faster, learning to hunt, demonstrating discipline, Scar praises him in ways Simba hungers for. There is no one else. There has never been anyone else. Mufasa exists in Simba's mind now as a figure from a distant, dreamlike past, a legend his uncle tells him about, a memory that grows hazier with each passing season. That the boy also realizes, dimly, that Scar has taught him to doubt the very person who could have verified the truth is something Simba does not yet understand. He simply knows that the memories of his father feel less real than the solid, present warmth of Scar's approval. By the end of month 9, the lie and the truth have traded places in Simba's mind, quiet and complete as a sunset. The boy has not forgotten that his father died. But he has begun to forget why and how and at whose hand. He has begun, instead, to remember a story where he was small and frightened, and loved so intensely that it broke the one who loved him. He has begun to accept that this is simply the way the world is. That Scar alone understands this, and Scar alone can protect him from it. And that, more than any lock or cage, is the true darkness into which Simba has descended. A year into Scar's rule, the Pride lands had become unrecognizable, not because of any sudden catastrophe, but because of the slow, patient erosion of everything Mufasa had built. The herds, once so thick across the savannah that you could see their dust from Pride Rock itself, had thinned to scattered groups, and then to groups so scattered that a lioness could hunt all day and return with nothing. The wildebeest, the zebra, the antelope that formed the foundation of the circle of life, they were gone, driven away or consumed by the hyena clans that Scar had invited to feast without restraint. Shenzi, Banzai, and Ed, the 3 lieutenants who commanded the hyena packs, had made no secret of their appetite. They hunted not to live, but to assert dominance, leaving carcasses half-eaten and the grasslands trampled into wasteland. And Scar, sitting in his throne beneath Pride Rock's stone, seemed not to notice or not to care. Above ground, the lionesses moved like ghosts through a landscape of ash and bone. Nala, still young but no longer a cub, had grown lean and watchful, her ribs visible beneath her fur, her eyes dark with a hunger that was becoming as much spiritual as physical. Sarabi, the queen, moved among them with a dignity that starvation could not erode. But dignity does not fill bellies, and I think she knew that more clearly than anyone. The land itself had forgotten how to give. The grass, once emerald and alive, had turned grey and brittle. The water holes that should have been constant had become seasonal, drying to mud and then to dust. And there were bones everywhere, so many bones that you began to understand them not as the remains of meals, but as the visible evidence of a kingdom cannibalizing itself. I think what is important to understand is that this was not an accident. Mufasa's philosophy, the one he had tried to pass to Simba in those early mornings, was built on a principle, that a king was not separate from his land, but part of it, answerable to it, a steward of the circle that fed everyone. Scar rejected this entirely. He had spent his whole life resenting the circle of life, because the circle had decided, long ago, that his brother was the king, and he was not. So when he took the throne, he did not simply neglect the circle, he actively dismantled it. He allowed the hyenas to hunt without limit, to breed without consequence, to treat the Pride lands not as a place to live in balance, but as a resource to be stripped bare. And each time a lioness came to him asking why the herds were failing, why the young were going hungry, why the old were beginning to die, he responded with contempt. It was their fault for being weak, he said. It was weakness that required the circle of life, he said. A true king did not genuflect to nature. A true king bent nature to his will. And so the land deteriorated not despite his rule, but because of it. There is a principle in how power corrupts, I think, that goes beyond simple cruelty. There is something in the narcissistic mind that cannot tolerate the existence of systems larger than itself. Scar could not accept that the Pride lands operated according to a logic older and deeper than his own will. So he broke that logic, and the breaking of it broke everything else. Below Pride Rock, in the hidden den where Simba lived in perpetual darkness, the boy was beginning to understand hunger in a way that most young creatures never do. Scar kept him alive, just barely, but the meals were sparse, calculated, timed to create a state of constant, gnawing deprivation. By day, the cub could hear the chaos above, the roars of hyenas, the desperate cries of lionesses who had not eaten in days, the sound of a kingdom tearing itself apart. By night, there was only silence, and the occasional scrape of Scar's claws on stone as he descended to the den, bringing with him a small portion of meat and the weight of his presence. The boy had been in darkness so long that he had begun to forget what light looked like. His memories of the stampede, of Mufasa falling, of Scar's face above him in the gorge, had become soft and dreamlike, overwritten by a year of Scar's patient narrative that painted the boy himself as guilty, complicit, responsible for the death of the father he could no longer quite remember. And here is what I find myself thinking about, sitting with this part of the story. Simba was starving in a kingdom that was starving, both of them dying in different ways in the same place, separated only by stone and darkness. The irony is not lost on me. The heir to the Pride lands, the one who might have prevented this collapse if circumstances had been different, was being kept alive in a tomb while the land above him withered away, as if Scar was nursing a secret wound, a proof of his own power, even as that power destroyed everything around him. Meanwhile, in the chambers and gathering places of Pride Rock, the lionesses were beginning to break. Sarabi, who had never spoken against Scar before, finally demanded that he take action, that he lead them to new hunting grounds, that he at least acknowledge the famine that was killing them. And Scar, in a moment that the Pride would never forget, struck her. The blow was not light, and it was meant to be seen. It was meant to demonstrate that there was no limit to his contempt, that even the former queen was subject to his will, that even her maternal defiance could be erased with a single gesture of violence. The Pride watched it happen, and something shifted in the way they looked at their king. They had already accepted his rule. They had already absorbed his narrative that Mufasa was dead, that the old way was gone, that this hunger was simply the price of survival. But the image of Scar's paw against Sarabi's face, that was something different. That was proof that their king was not merely failing, he was choosing to fail. And yet they could not leave. Scar had forbidden any migration, any abandonment of Pride Rock, any attempt to find water and prey elsewhere. He kept the Pride trapped in the collapsing kingdom, trapped beneath the slow tyranny of starvation, trapped by the hyenas who moved freely through their territory, and the promise that if they disobeyed, there would be worse than hunger waiting for them. Rafiki's tree, where the royal painter had once recorded the births and ascensions of every king, had been abandoned long ago, and the portrait of Mufasa that had hung there, the one that connected past to present, had been defaced beyond recognition. The paint dried and cracked, as if the land itself was rejecting the memory of what it had lost. And so the year turned, and the Pride lands became less a kingdom and more a graveyard, and Scar sat in his throne and called it victory. The boy in the darkness below heard the sounds of his kingdom dying and could do nothing about it, and his father's killer called this mercy, keeping him alive, keeping him fed just enough to survive, keeping him as a secret prisoner in a dying land, bound to Scar by starvation and darkness, and the slowly dissolving certainty that there had ever been any other way at all. Year 2 of Scar's reign, and the machinery of control had begun to show its shape. Not crude, never crude, but intricate and almost elegant in the way it bound everyone who lived beneath it. The Pride lands had become something like a machine for the production of hunger, And hunger, I think, is one of the most reliable tools a tyrant has ever held. The herds were gone now, or nearly gone. The hyenas had done their work with ruthless efficiency, and what little prey remained scattered across the drying grasslands was fought over with increasing desperation. Above ground, the lionesses ate less and less. Sarabi, who had once carried herself with the weight of a queen, now moved with the careful gait of an animal who had learned to conserve energy, to take up less space. Nala, still young enough to remember the abundance before, watched the adults grow thin and did not fully understand why her hunger had become something so permanent. But Scar ate well, and the hyena commanders, Shenzi sharp-eyed and calculating, Banzai violent and eager, Ed laughing his strange, hollow laugh, they ate well too. This was not an accident, this was deliberate. Scar kept the best kills for himself, took his portions from the center of every successful hunt, and what remained filtered down through the pride in ratios he controlled absolutely. There was a zebra leg he particularly favored. I find myself thinking about this detail because it is so small, so precisely concrete, and yet it contains something about the nature of his rule. He would gnaw on it alone in his chambers while the lionesses shared scraps, and everyone knew it. Everyone saw it. The knowledge was the point. Below Pride Rock, in the darkness where Simba lived, the boy received enough to keep him alive, the careful minimum that prevented death but ensured constant, gnawing deprivation. Scar brought the food himself, always himself, so that every breath Simba took that sustained life came wrapped in the presence of his uncle, his captor, his sole connection to the world above. The cub had learned, by the second year of his captivity, not to question this arrangement. The darkness had taught him that survival was conditional, that food arrived at the discretion of the one voice that spoke to him, that gratitude and hunger were the primary languages of existence. I think there is something deeply understood between a keeper and a kept animal about the way power flows through sustenance, and by year 2, Simba understood it as surely as he understood breath. During the day, or what passed for day in that sealed chamber, Scar would sometimes visit with fresh meat, and Simba would eat with a child's unself-conscious hunger, and Scar would watch with an expression that was almost paternal, almost warm, the kind of warmth a hunter might feel regarding a trap that continues to function perfectly. He would ask the boy questions about his memories of the stampede, gentle questions, the way you might ask a child about their day. Do you remember the sound, Simba? Do you remember how you felt when the earth began to move? Each time, Simba's answer would shift slightly, would drift further from what had actually occurred and closer to the version Scar had spent months carefully building, the version where the boy's own cry had triggered the chaos, where his own terror had caused the disaster. The repetition had worn grooves into his memory, the way water wears into stone. Above ground, Scar employed a parallel strategy with the pride itself, though his tools there had to be more visible, more theatrical. He did not hide his control, but rather displayed it, made it a feature of his reign rather than a secret. When a lioness dared to question the food distribution, when someone whispered about the herds that had vanished or the hyenas that ate their fill while the pride starved, Scar would address the pride in council, his voice carrying that particular tone of injured reason that made refusal seem like irrationality. "I am doing everything I can," he would say, with genuine-sounding weariness. "The land has turned against us. Can you not see it? The drought is not my making. The herds have abandoned the pride lands through no fault of my rule. And the hyenas," he would add, "are our allies in this time of scarcity, necessary partners in our survival." The logic was circular and airtight. It required the listener to doubt their own eyes, to question whether the land had truly died or whether they simply were not grateful enough, not loyal enough, not willing to sacrifice enough. Sarabi, the queen, resisted this logic with the quiet, implacable refusal that characterized her. She had watched her mate die under Scar's orchestration, though she did not yet know the full truth and she carried in her posture a kind of fundamental rejection of his authority. When Scar demanded she sit beside him, take on the trappings of a new queen, she refused with a silence more eloquent than any words could have been. This infuriated him in a way that brute rebellion might not have, because silence cannot be argued with, cannot be shamed into submission. So he punished it by exclusion. He ate first and best. He fed the hyenas generously in her sight, and when the pride went hungry, he made sure she understood that her rebellion had consequences that fell on all of them. It was a form of governance that weaponized the bonds between them, that made their love for the pride into a tool of control. And it worked. By year 2, most of the lionesses had stopped openly questioning his decisions. They had learned, as surely as Simba had learned in his chamber below, that survival required compliance, that protest led to suffering, that gratitude was safer than truth. The circle of life, Mufasa's great teaching about balance and mutual sustenance and the way predator and prey were bound in necessity, had been inverted entirely. Under Scar's reign, there was no circle, only hierarchy. The strong ate while the weak weakened, and the spectacle of that imbalance was displayed openly as evidence of Scar's power. The land itself had become part of his argument. Look at the drought, he could say, gesturing across the barren grasslands. Look at how the world itself obeys the natural order of strength and submission. The irony, of course, and I think this is crucial to understanding how Scar's rule actually functioned, was that the drought was not natural at all, that the death of the herds was the direct consequence of inviting the hyenas to hunt without restraint, that the wasteland around Pride Rock was his own creation mirrored back at him like an accusation he could not hear. But in year 2 of his reign, Scar had learned to narrate that wasteland as evidence of his wisdom, as proof that his way was necessary, as vindication of the worldview that had always been his. That survival was war, that love was weakness, that the only truth worth knowing was power. And below, in the dark, his adopted heir was learning to believe the same things. The machinery was working. The control was absolute. And yet, and there is something in this I keep returning to, the more tightly Scar bound everyone around him, the more his grip began to require constant attention, constant feeding, constant reassertion. A lion who rules through strength might rest easy. A lion who rules through control must never sleep, never relax, never trust that the narrative he has constructed will hold without his constant intervention. By year 2, Scar had become trapped in the very apparatus he had built, bound as surely as Simba was bound, though neither of them understood it yet. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from having everything you thought you wanted and discovering, in the having of it, that it tastes like ash. By the 2nd year of Scar's reign, the king had the throne, the crown, the fear of every lioness in Pride Rock, and still something in him was not satisfied. The Pride lands were collapsing around him, the herds thinning, the hyenas multiplying beyond even Shenzi's control, the soil itself turning to dust, and yet none of it soothed the hunger that had driven him to murder his own brother. I think what he had not anticipated, in all his careful planning, was what it would feel like to win everything and still be powerless to make it mean anything. Below Pride Rock, in the darkness where Simba now lived in his 2nd year of captivity, Scar had begun to spend more and more of his time. Not as a captor checking on his prisoner, though he was that, but as something closer to a man visiting the only thing in his kingdom that could not reject him. By this point, the cub had grown into a young lion, his frame filling out, his mane beginning to darken with the red gold of his father, and there was something about the sight of Mufasa's blood moving through Simba's veins that made Scar's single eye burn with a feeling he had never quite learned to name. Envy, perhaps, or a kind of twisted hunger. He would stand at the edge of the stone platform where Simba slept and simply watch the boy for long minutes, his tail moving slowly back and forth like a pendulum marking time. You must understand, Scar had not kept Simba alive by accident. In the days immediately following the stampede, when he could have let the hyenas finish what he had begun, when Simba was broken and starving and small enough that a single swipe would have ended the question forever, Scar had chosen differently. It was not mercy. I want to be very clear about that. But it was a choice, and choices reveal something about the person making them. Scar had looked at his dead brother's son and seen not a liability but a tool, not a burden but a possession. And in that moment, something in him had shifted from murderer to something more complicated and infinitely more disturbed. He could tell the kingdom that Simba had died, but Simba himself would know the truth, would know that Scar had chosen to let him live, that every breath he took was a gift from the uncle who had killed his father. There was a kind of power in that, and power was the only thing Scar had ever truly loved. As the boy grew, Scar began to bring him things. Fresh meat, sometimes, cut into pieces small enough for a young lion's jaws, a luxury in those months when the lionesses above ground were learning to go hungry. Smooth stones from the riverbed, worn soft by water, which Simba would hold and gnaw as his teeth came in. Stories whispered in the dark about the greatness of the lion who cared for him, the uncle who had saved him from the stampede that had taken everything else away. I find myself thinking about the texture of this carefully because it matters. Scar was not performing affection for an audience. There was no one to see this, no lioness or hyena to report back that the king was soft with his captive. This was something he was doing for himself, and the fact of that, the fact that he needed this, needed Simba, needed to be loved by this one creature who had been given no choice but to accept his love, tells us something true about what exile and envy had done to his heart. But affection from a captor is not affection. It is something else, something that wears affection's face. It is control, wearing tenderness like a mask. By month 8 of year 2, Scar had begun to speak aloud about Simba in a way he never had before, and I think this is where the obsession truly takes root. He would walk past Zazu in his cage, the majordomo, now prisoner, forced to perform as the king's entertainment, and murmur about the boy, about his potential, about how one day Simba would understand that everything Scar had done was not cruelty but preparation. Not imprisonment, but education. Zazu, who had served Mufasa and loved Simba like a son, would go very still at these words, his feathers pulling tight against his body, because he alone among the living knew what was happening in the darkness below the stone. Scar would stand at the edge of the eastern precipice where the herds used to gather, watching the dust where the game had been, and he would imagine Simba standing beside him, not a captive, but a son, wearing the face of a dead brother and choosing, of his own will, to stand with the uncle who had raised him. This was the fantasy that was eating him from the inside, the possibility that he could take Mufasa's heir, strip away everything Mufasa had tried to teach him, and remake him into something new, something loyal, something that bore the weight of his father's blood but thought with Scar's mind. The heir and the trophy, both at once. Proof of his victory, and the living symbol of his dynasty. But here is the thing I want you to hold close. It was also proof of his desperation. A king who truly held power does not need to spend hours in darkness with a captive boy, whispering about love and loyalty. A king who truly satisfied his hunger does not need to remake his brother's son into a mirror of himself. Scar needed Simba to love him because nothing else, not the throne, not the fear of his lionesses, not the roar that echoed across a dying kingdom, could fill the empty place where a father's approval had never lived. And Simba, in the darkness, had nowhere else to turn. The boy's memory of that night was almost gone now, replaced entirely by Scar's patient, repeated version. When Simba dreamed, he dreamed of his own roar causing the stampede, of his own weakness killing his father, and of the uncle who had come to the ruins of his grief and offered food, warmth, and the only voice in the world that seemed to understand the weight of what he had done. That Scar had done it, that all of it was a careful construction built on lies and hunger, and the love of a predator for something trapped and helpless. Simba could no longer quite access that thought. It lived too far behind him, in a past he could no longer reach. And so the second year of Scar's reign entered its autumn, with the king spending his evenings in darkness with the heir he had made, both of them locked together in a bond that looked like love from the inside and tasted like poison. Above ground, the Pride lands continued to die. Sarabi continued to resist, her eye steady and cold whenever Scar passed. The hyenas grew lean and hungry themselves as the herds disappeared. And below, in the stone chambers, where time did not move the same way, a boy who had been a prince learned to call his father's killer father. And Scar learned what it felt like to be needed by the one creature in his kingdom who could never leave. By the third year of Scar's reign, something had begun to shift in the minds of the Pride, though none of them could say exactly when it started or who first gave voice to the thought that should never have been spoken aloud. In the spaces between hunts, in the shadows of the acacia trees where the hyenas did not patrol, lionesses whispered to one another. What if the cub had not died in the gorge? What if Simba had run, as young things do, and was alive somewhere beyond the Pride lands, waiting, remembering, bearing witness to his uncle's rule? These were dangerous questions, the kind of questions that could topple thrones, and Scar, for all his intelligence, for all his careful construction of narrative and control, understood this with the clarity of a creature who has built his entire world on a single lie. The whispers did not come from nowhere. They began, I think, in the oldest parts of the Pride's memory, places where Scar's authority could not quite reach, the deep institutional knowledge that lionesses passed to one another across generations. They began because some of the older mothers, the ones who had served under Mufasa, understood what a king was supposed to be, and what Scar decidedly was not. They began because Sarabi, the queen, had never fully submitted, and her silence was itself a form of resistance that younger lionesses could read like a text. Sarabi had challenged Scar openly over the hunts, had demanded action as her position entitled her to demand, and though he had struck her for it, a blow that echoed through Pride Rock like a crack in stone, she had not been broken by it. There is something about a mother who refuses to bend that teaches her daughters what dignity looks like, even in the shape of a black eye. The whispers also began, I suspect, because the kingdom was dying so visibly that pretending otherwise had become impossible. In year 2, there had still been the possibility of blame, drought, mischance, the natural turning of seasons. But by year 3, the pattern had become too clear to dismiss as misfortune. The hyenas hunted without restraint. The herds dwindled toward nothing. The lionesses, including Scar himself, grew thinner, though Scar somehow remained well-fed while his subjects starved. A cub watches her mother go out to hunt and return with nothing, night after night, and begins to understand that the land does not simply fail, it is failed. Scar could not control this mathematics. He could control the telling of history, the official narrative of Simba's death, the erasure of Mufasa's name from ceremony and prayer. But he could not control hunger, and hunger is a truth that whispers in the belly where no propaganda can reach. So the question arose, almost as a natural fact: if Simba were alive, would things be different? If the heir had somehow survived and lived in exile, gathering his strength, remembering his father's way, would the Pride lands still be ash? The question itself was a kind of prayer, a way of saying that they had not accepted this, that they still believed in the possibility of a different future. And because the question had been asked, it could not be unasked. It lived now in the spaces between conversations, in the looks exchanged during Scar's speeches, in the careful non-participation of the lionesses when hyenas walked among them. Scar felt it. I do not think this is speculation. I think this is the nature of the creature he had become. A tyrant can tolerate open rebellion far more easily than he can tolerate doubt, because rebellion can be crushed. while doubt is invisible and spreads like a stain through the architecture of his control. And Scar, for all his calculation, had built his entire legitimacy on the assumption that Simba was dead, that this death was accepted, that the Pride had moved forward into a new era. The whisper of the cub's possible survival was a whisper that Scar himself might be wrong, might be illegitimate, might be a usurper sitting on a throne that still belonged to another. So he tightened his grip. In the months that followed, Scar's methods shifted from the psychological manipulation we have already traced to something more overtly terroristic. He increased the presence of hyena patrols around Pride Rock itself, posting them at the waterholes, at the hunting grounds, visibly inserting them into the daily life of the Pride in ways that made it clear they were not guests, but occupiers. Shenzi, the eldest and most cunning of the hyena leaders, understood her role perfectly. She became Scar's eyes and ears, reporting on which lionesses gathered together, which ones spoke too freely, which ones seemed sympathetic to the whispered question of Simba's survival. The hyenas were themselves not fully trusted. Scar knew this, and they knew that he knew, but they served the function he required, a layer of enforcers between him and the Pride, a buffer that would absorb the violence of potential rebellion while keeping his own paws bloodless. He also, and this is a detail I find myself thinking about, intensified his control over information and memory itself. Rafiki, the mandrill keeper of royal lineage, the shaman who painted the face of each cub born to Pride Rock on his baobab tree, had erased Simba's image when he believed the cub dead, as was ritual. But a keeper of memory, even in captivity or in fear, remains something more than a tool. Scar ensured that Rafiki was watched, that his tree was monitored, that there could be no restoration of the painted image without Scar's knowledge and permission. He did the same with every artifact of Mufasa's reign, every symbol that could be weaponized by the whispers into something resembling hope. The name of Mufasa, already forbidden, became doubly forbidden, not merely unspoken, but actively dangerous to invoke. Lions who had served the old king found themselves isolated, questioned, watched. Zazu, imprisoned since the beginning, was moved to a smaller cage, closer to Scar's private chambers, where he could be monitored more carefully, and where his knowledge of the Pride's true history could be more thoroughly contained. But even as Scar tightened his external controls, something else was happening, something he could not fully see or prevent. The whisper itself, the simple, dangerous question of whether Simba lived, had become a form of psychological resistance. It created a space, however small, where the Pride could imagine an alternative, where they could hold in their minds the possibility that this was not permanent, that injustice was not inevitable. The whispers did not lead to action, not yet, and certainly not to organized rebellion that Scar could identify and crush. But they created the psychological conditions under which such action might one day become possible. And that possibility, more than any immediate threat, was what Scar sensed and feared. Below Pride Rock, in the hidden den where Simba remained captive and psychologically reconfigured, the cub knew nothing of these whispers. He knew nothing of the whispers, and Scar ensured he would never know them, because once Simba understood that he was being sought, that he was remembered, that others believed him still alive, the entire apparatus of his captivity might begin to crack. Scar kept the boy separated not only from the Pride, but from the very knowledge that the Pride was questioning his death. In this way, above and below Pride Rock, two parallel realities existed, the Pride moving slowly toward doubt, toward memory, toward the possibility of resistance, while below, Simba remained locked in the singular narrative that his uncle had constructed for him, unaware that he was already, in some sense, the center of a quiet revolution. As Simba moved into his adolescence, something in him began to shift that no amount of Scar's careful narrative could entirely suppress. The simple, overwhelming force of his own body asking questions his mind was not yet allowed to answer. His bones were lengthening, his shoulders broadening, and beneath his golden fur, the faint shadow of a mane was beginning to darken, the visible sign that he was becoming, despite everything, what he was born to be. Scar noticed it, of course. Scar noticed everything about the boy who had become the center of his private world. And instead of seeing only threat in that transformation, he saw opportunity. A maturing heir meant a maturing heir's hunger, and hunger, as Scar had learned long ago, was the most reliable leash of all. But what Scar could not so easily control was the simple, restless curiosity that came with adolescence, that drive to understand the space you inhabited, to push at the boundaries of the cage you did not yet know was a cage. It began with small things. Simba asking why certain passages in the den beneath Pride Rock were sealed with stone, why some chambers echoed differently than others, why his entire world seemed to end at particular thresholds that Scar forbade him to cross. Scar's answers were always ready, woven with the same careful patience he had used to reshape Simba's memories of the stampede. Some chambers were dangerous, he would say, unstable, prone to collapse, a risk to a young lion not yet wise enough to navigate them safely. Others held only the broken remnants of the old regime, debris best left undisturbed, evidence of the past that served no purpose but to wound. The boy should focus on the present, on his preparation, on the training that mattered, not on the archaeology of a dead king's ambitions. Yet curiosity, once it flowers in a mind that has been kept in darkness, becomes its own kind of hunger, and no explanation, however reasonable, could entirely satisfy it. Simba found himself, in the hours when Scar was above ground, attending to the visible work of his rule, moving through the hidden chambers with a new intentionality, testing the boundaries of his world like a young lion testing the strength of a rock wall. Some sealed passages he could not move. Others, he discovered, had been sealed only partially, the stones fitted together loosely enough that a determined adolescent could shift them, could peer into the gaps and see glimpses of what lay beyond. What he found in those gaps was fragmentary at first, the edge of a painting on a stone wall, colors still vivid beneath layers of dust, blues and golds that seemed to echo something in his fractured memory, but remained just out of reach. An old bone, larger than any he had seen in the feeding chamber, carved with marks he could not read, but understood somehow meant something, carried weight. A scrap of cloth, red and black, the colors of ceremony, of occasions that existed somewhere in the landscape of his real but buried past. He did not speak of these discoveries to Scar, and that silence was itself a new thing. The first small rebellion of a mind beginning, however tentatively, to operate independently of his captor's approved narratives. There was, too, a growing awareness that came with adolescence and could not be entirely suppressed. The understanding that the chambers in which he lived, though vast in the darkness, were contained, finite, trapped within a single stone mountain. Scar had always told him that the Pride lands beyond were dying, that the outside world was chaos, that his uncle had saved him from that chaos by keeping him safe in the hidden depths of Pride Rock. But a maturing lion's body carries instincts that predate any narrative, and those instincts whispered something different, that there was a world above him, that the stone ceiling above was not the limit of all things, that the air he breathed came from somewhere, from beyond, from above, from a place that the darkness had prevented him from ever fully imagining. One afternoon, when Scar was occupied with a confrontation among the Pride, Sarabi had grown bold again, or Shenzi had challenged some aspect of his authority, the specifics did not matter. Simba ventured further than he had ever dared into the sealed passages, pushing the loose stones with new determination. The gap widened, stone dust falling away, and suddenly he could see not just fragments, but a whole section of the painted wall that lay behind them. It was a mural, he understood at once, ancient, formal, meant to commemorate something important. It showed a lion, golden and majestic, standing on a high stone outcrop with the sun behind him, and beside him, smaller, a cub. The cub's features were rendered with such precise gentleness that Simba found himself staring, unable to look away, unable to fully understand what it was he was seeing. He knew with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely that the image meant something to him, that it contained a truth that Scar had worked very hard to bury. The voice, when it came from behind him, was soft but absolute. "I wondered when you would begin to piece it together, my boy." Scar emerged from the darkness of the back passage, and in his expression was not anger but something more complex, a mixture of affection and resignation, as though he had always known this moment would come and had been waiting for it with something approaching pride. "The paintings are nothing," he said gently, moving to stand beside Simba and gazing at the mural with him. "The work of artisans centuries dead, commemorating old fantasies about old kings, not truths, not anymore." But Simba noticed that Scar did not order him away from the mural, did not seal the passage fully again, and that small mercy, that allowance, felt like the first small fracture in the wall that had held him contained. Above ground, Scar continued his careful reign, feeding the hyenas, maintaining his grip through fear and careful distribution of the last of the hunt, while the pride lands withered further into a landscape of bones and ash, and the wind carried the scent of a world dying by design. Below, in the hidden chambers, Simba stood for a long time before the painted lion and the painted cub, understanding that he was beginning to remember something, and that remembering was the most dangerous thing he could do. There comes a moment in every tyranny, I think, when the ruler realizes that control itself can become a cage, and that the only way to break free from it is to loosen the bars, just slightly, to test whether the prisoner has anywhere else to go. It was in Simba's 15th year that Scar first permitted his captive nephew to walk beyond the hidden den, to breathe the air above ground under the falling dark, to see the ruins of what the boy's father had once stewarded. The decision was not merciful, though it wore mercy's face. It was the logic of a man who had grown tired of feeding a ghost and wanted to see whether the ghost had become real enough to love him. Simba emerged blinking into the twilight, tall now, broad-shouldered, his mane beginning to darken with maturity, his body finally catching up to the hunger that had defined his captivity. What he found above ground was not the kingdom Scar had described to him in the darkness, but something closer to the truth. A land of ash and bone, herds gone, the soil itself cracked and pale, the hyenas moving freely through a domain they had systematically hollowed. Scar watched him take it in, this young lion who had known nothing but stone and shadow and his uncle's voice, and there was something almost tender in Scar's expression, the way a collector might regard a piece he had shaped with his own hands over years of careful work. "Do you understand now," the uncle said, "what I have protected you from? All this ruin and hunger, your mother's people brought it on themselves, through weakness and blind devotion to the old ways. I have kept you apart from it, kept you fed, kept you alive when you might have perished with them." The words were shaped to feel like salvation, like debt, like love. And Simba, who had never known anything else, felt them settle into his chest like stones. For 3 months, Scar granted him these evening walks, always supervised, always within sight of Pride Rock's shadow. The captive nephew learned the hunting routes his uncle now controlled, saw the lionesses, thin now, hollow-eyed, moving through the wasteland in search of prey that barely existed anymore. He saw Sarabi, his mother, though she did not recognize him. She had grieved him as dead so long ago that the tall adolescent lion at Scar's side seemed like a phantom, a stranger wearing a familiar face. There was something in the way she looked at him that cut deeper than any darkness had, a confusion and hope and denial all at once, and Simba felt the strings of Scar's narrative begin to fray. But Scar saw the moment the fraying began, and he was too skilled at this to allow it to continue. That night, after the walk, he brought Simba to the edge of a gorge, not the wildebeest gorge where Mufasa had died, but another one, narrower, deeper, where the bones of fallen prey collected in the shadows below. "Do you see how the weak perish here?" Scar asked quietly. How the land itself punishes hesitation, doubt, the inability to accept hard truths. Your mother was strong once, but age has made her sentimental, and sentimentality is another word for self-destruction. If you were to leave this place, if you were foolish enough to try, you would find her waiting for you with that same confusion in her eyes, expecting you to be the cub she lost. And when you are not that cub, when you cannot be that cub, she will die of that disappointment. Simba felt the ground beneath his paws shift, felt the careful equilibrium Scar had spent years building begin to consolidate around him again. Do you understand what I am asking of you? Scar continued, his voice softer now, almost broken with something that might have been genuine pain if you did not know it was performance. I am asking whether you will love me enough to remain, or whether you will be cruel enough to leave, knowing what that departure will cost the ones you left behind. It was the most exquisite cruelty, not the threat of what Scar would do if Simba tried to escape, but the implication of what Simba himself would do by trying, the weight of his mother's potential suffering placed entirely on his own shoulders. For weeks after, Simba did not ask to walk above ground, and Scar did not offer. Instead, his uncle brought him deeper into the hidden passages, further from the main den, into chambers where murals still bore the faint impressions of Mufasa's rule. Lions in the old royal pose, the setting sun behind them, the circle of life painted in ochre and ash. Here, Scar taught him, is where the old weakness is stored, preserved like a corpse. Your father believed that all of life was bound together, that predator and prey were balanced by some invisible hand. But that is fantasy, boy. It is the comfort story a king tells himself so he does not have to face what he truly is. I have shown you the truth. That power is not inherited, it is taken. That mercy is the luxury of the strong. That love itself is only another way of saying I will keep you fed as long as you remain mine. Simba listened, and something in him, something shaped by years of darkness and hunger and the absence of any other voice, believed him. But something else in him, something stirred by the murals and the sight of his mother's confused eyes, and the memory of a man he could no longer quite picture, did not. It was this tension that Scar was testing, the thread of doubt he had glimpsed beginning to unravel in his nephew's mind. The cruelty was not in what Scar threatened to do if Simba tried to escape. The cruelty was in having shown him, however briefly, that escape was theoretically possible, and then demonstrating, with perfect precision and economy, why such escape would destroy him. It is a peculiar form of control. I think the kind that doesn't require chains because the captive has internalized the bars, made them part of his own mind, his own love, his own sense of what is right and wrong and possible. That is what those 3 months of limited freedom accomplished. They did not liberate Simba, but rather confirmed to him that he was already liberated in the only way that mattered, by being so completely entangled with the man who held him that freedom would mean death, either his own or someone else's. By autumn of that year, Simba had returned to the darkness voluntarily, without any command or restraint, and Scar had never needed to use force again, because the boy now understood that force was not necessary. Love was enough, or the memory of love, or the fear of its withdrawal, which in the end amount to the same thing. The mercy was perfect because it was calculated to seem like love, and the cruelty was perfect because it felt like choice. There is a peculiar thing that happens when you have loved someone and they disappear and years pass without them. A kind of phantom presence that lingers at the edges of your awareness, not quite forgotten and not quite grieved. Nala had been a cub when Simba died, or when everyone said he died, and she had loved him the way cubs love, which is to say completely and without reservation, and then she had learned to live without him, which is to say she had not learned it at all, only become practiced at the appearance of acceptance. By her young adulthood, the pale cream lioness had grown into the shape of Scar's pride. Thinner than her mother Seraphina's generation had been, stronger in the shoulders from hunting what little remained, watchful in the way that prey animals become when living under a predator's gaze. She had seen her mother's spirit diminish year by year under Scar's rule, watched Sarabi, the queen, though Scar would never acknowledge the title, carry her dignity like a shield that was slowly cracking under the weight of silence. She had made herself useful to survive, quick enough to hunt the dwindling herds, quiet enough to avoid Scar's attention, careful enough to never speak aloud the things she thought about the king who ruled them or the brother, who was no brother who had died before she was old enough to understand what death meant. And then one evening, as the sun descended and the shadows at Pride Rock's edge grew long, she saw something that stopped her breath, a glimpse of gold. It was only for a moment, between the rocks, a tawny shape that did not belong to any lioness she knew, that was too large, too thickly maned, the colouring wrong in a way that made her heart do something complicated and unfamiliar. Golden, she thought, her mind reaching for a word she had not needed in years. Like Mufasa, like. But she did not let the thought complete itself, because to think it was dangerous, and because Scar had made it clear that to remember Mufasa was to invite suspicion, and because the only male lion near Pride Rock was the one who ruled them, and a second one should not exist. She waited until she was certain she was alone, and then she moved toward where she had seen the glimmer, careful and quiet, the way a lion stalks prey, or the way she had learned to move through the world under Scar's reign, which sometimes felt the same thing. There was nothing there, only the stone and the shadows, and a faint trace of scent on the wind that made her fur stand on end, something both utterly strange and impossibly familiar. She did not return to the Pride immediately. Instead, she sat for a long time in the dimming light, her mind turning over the moment, trying to make it fit into the world as she knew it, and finding that it did not fit at all. Over the following days, Nala found herself drawn again and again to that same edge of Pride Rock, always in the twilight, always moving as though her presence there was accidental rather than deliberate. She caught only fragments, a shadow that moved too deliberately to be mere breeze-blown stone, the distant sound of movement in the chambers beneath the rock, once the lingering warmth of a body where something large had rested in the cooling dusk. It was maddening, this half-seeing, this sense of a truth just beyond her grasp, and it awakened in her something that 3 years of Scar's rule had tried to suppress, a kind of dangerous curiosity, the instinct to investigate rather than to simply accept, to question rather than to comply. She began to ask careful questions of her mother, framing them as idle conversation. Had anyone ever spoken of Simba surviving? Did Sarafina remember him clearly enough to describe him? What colour was his fur? How tall had he grown before he died? Sarafina, who had learned the language of caution even more thoroughly than her daughter, answered as little as she could, but her eyes said something different. Do not ask these questions, they said. It is not safe. There was something in that warning that confirmed what Nala's instinct had already begun to know, that the question of Simba's death was not settled, that it was a wound that had been closed before it could properly heal, that it was dangerous precisely because it mattered, and because Scar's claim to the throne depended on his being truly dead. She watched Scar more carefully now, and she saw in his behavior a particular kind of tension, a way of moving through the pride that suggested he was managing multiple truths simultaneously, keeping several versions of the world separate in his mind. He visited the chambers beneath Pride Rock far more often than a king had any reason to do, and when he emerged, he moved with a curious mixture of satisfaction and anxiety, as though he were maintaining something he did not entirely trust, tending to something that required constant vigilance. Nala did not know what it was, but she knew that it was there, and she knew that it had a shape, a presence, something at the heart of Scar's rule that made him more powerful and more fragile all at once. One night, when sleep would not come, and the Pride lands were silent with the particular silence of a kingdom that is slowly dying, she made her way to the edge of the rock, drawn by instinct or memory or the phantom presence of a friend she had learned to forget. There was no one there, and yet the air itself seemed to hold a weight, a grief that was not quite finished grieving, a story that had been interrupted and never resumed. She understood in that moment that she could not continue as she had been, accepting, surviving, moving through the days as though they were all the same. Something had awakened in her that could not be put back to sleep. The memory of a cub she had loved, the possibility that he might not be a ghost, the terrible, clarifying certainty that her life under Scar's rule was a lie built on other lies, and that somewhere in the architecture of his kingdom, the truth was being kept alive. She did not know yet what she would do with this knowledge, or whether she had the courage to act on it, but she felt it settle into her chest like a stone, heavy and real and immovable. The mystery would not leave her alone, and Nala, for the first time since Simba's death, allowed herself to stop pretending that she was truly at peace with his loss. There is a kind of grief that masquerades as acceptance until something small and true disturbs it, and then the whole careful construction collapses, and you are left standing in the wreckage of everything you told yourself you had made peace with. And so Nala began to watch, to wait, to investigate the edges of Scar's kingdom, looking for the golden shadow she had glimpsed, following the thread of a mystery that would, in time, lead her to confront not only the past, but the cost of all the survival she had learned to call peace. Nala had begun to move through the pride with a kind of careful, deliberate attention that was not quite investigation, but also not quite accident, the way you might follow a thread that you found in your own paw and pull it gently to see what it might lead to. She had accepted, as everyone had, that Simba was dead. There had been no reason not to accept it. The story was seamless, and she had been young enough then that the loss had come and gone like a season. But something in what she had seen at the edge of Pride Rock would not settle. A lion she did not know, golden-furred and lithe, moving through the territory at dusk, familiar in a way she could not articulate, as though his shape held the echo of something she had known once. The more she thought about it, the more she began to notice other small inconsistencies. The way Scar would vanish into the lower chambers for hours without explanation, the particular care he took in carrying meat down into the dark, the flinch that crossed his scarred face whenever questions arose about that long-ago night in the gorge. There is something in the way a lie sits in a structure. If you look closely enough, it creates small fractures, small spaces where the truth tries to press through. One night, when the hyena patrols had shifted and the moon was low enough to offer shadow, Nala descended into the passages beneath Pride Rock, her heart moving in a way that felt like both courage and betrayal. The darkness underground was absolute, the kind of darkness that seemed to have weight and temperature, and she moved through it with her ears forward and her breath controlled. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that something alive was breathing in these chambers, something that Scar was at great pains to keep hidden from the rest of the pride. When she found him, she nearly did not recognize him at all. The boy she had known had been small and playful, all energy and absence of doubt. The young lion she found in that dark chamber was tall and broad-shouldered, with Mufasa's distinctive red mane and eyes that held a complexity that should not have existed in a face so young. But underneath the unfamiliar size, underneath the years written into his bearing, there was something, a tilt of his head, the particular shape of his face in profile, that sent a shock of recognition through her entire body. "Simba," she said, and the name seemed to crack the silence like stone. His response was not what she had expected. Not joy, not confusion, but a kind of careful, controlled fear, the fear of something that has learned not to move suddenly. She told him, her voice steady and urgent, that the pride believed him dead, that Scar had claimed both he and Mufasa had died in the stampede, that the land above was dying because Scar had invited the hyenas to hunt without limit, that she had come to bring him out, to restore him to his rightful place as heir to Mufasa's throne. She spoke quickly, aware that they had only moments before Scar would return, before the hyenas would make their nightly rounds through the lower passages. She spoke as though the truth were simple, as though years of captivity and careful psychological reconstruction could simply be burned away by the clarity of her voice and the undeniable fact of her presence. But Simba did not move toward escape. Instead, he moved away from her, his body language closing in ways that seemed almost involuntary. "You don't understand," he said, and his voice held not the straightforward fear of a prisoner, but something more complex, a kind of anguish, a deep dissonance between what she was telling him and what he had been taught to believe. He told her that Scar had saved him, that on the night of the stampede, when he was lost and broken and drowning in guilt for what had happened to his father, Scar alone had found him and offered him shelter and understanding. He told her that his father had been a tyrant, that the philosophy of the circle of life was a cage, that Scar had shown him a way of being that was free from the crushing weight of expectation and legacy. He told her that everyone he loved, Scar, the order of things, the life he had come to understand, would be destroyed if he left, that his escape would be a betrayal of the only father who had ever truly cared for him. Nala, listening to this, felt the truth of what had happened settle into her with a kind of sickening clarity. Scar had not merely imprisoned the boy, he had remade him, had planted his own logic so deep that Simba could not see his own cage. She understood in that moment that simply being found was not enough, that the rescue she had imagined, a simple retrieval of the lost heir, was not what this situation required. She did not have time, in those few minutes before danger, to do the slow work of undoing years of careful psychological manipulation, to help him remember who he was before Scar taught him to forget. What she could do was plant a seed, a word, a name that might grow in the darkness and crack the foundation of what Scar had built. She told him about Mufasa, about the lion his father had actually been, about the legacy that was his by right and blood, about the circle of life not as a cage, but as a promise that he belonged to something larger than Scar's solitary vision. She told him that she remembered him, that the pride remembered him, that there was a version of his story that Scar had taken from him. And then, because she heard the sound of paws on stone echoing from deeper in the passages, she turned and ran back toward the surface, leaving him in the darkness with the weight of her words and the first real question in his carefully ordered world. In the chambers below, in the silence after she was gone, Simba stood alone with the echo of her voice and the strange, terrible sensation of something he had believed, something solid and necessary, beginning to fracture at its foundation. Above ground, the Pride lands continued their slow dying. The hyenas roamed, and Scar rested, unaware that the most careful architecture of control can be undone by a single name spoken into the dark. But the undoing is slow. The questioning, once begun, does not move quickly toward freedom. In the days after Nala found him in the dark chambers beneath Pride Rock, Simba could not stop thinking about the mural she had shown him, the great lion with the scar over his eye, his paw extended toward a small golden cub, and beneath them both a single word painted in ochre, Father. But it was not the painting that troubled him most. It was the way Nala had spoken Mufasa's name, the way her voice had held grief and certainty in equal measure, as if she were calling to someone she had loved and still loved. For 6 years, Scar had told him stories about his father, about a lion consumed by his own pride, whose love was a cage, whose legacy was burden rather than blessing. Scar had told him that Mufasa died because he was weak, and that Simba's roar in the chaos of the stampede was the final rupture that had broken everything. But Nala's eyes held a different story, and that story was beginning to grow in Simba's mind like a seed he could not unplant. He moved through Pride Rock as he had always moved, obedient, careful, knowing the hidden passages and the times when he could walk without being seen. But now he was looking, truly looking at the kingdom around him in a way he had never allowed himself to before. The bones that lay scattered across the plateau were not the natural order that Scar had always framed them, as they were the aftermath of something that had been allowed to collapse. The lionesses who moved through the ash were not thriving. They were diminishing, their ribs visible beneath their thinning coats, their eyes hollow with a hunger that seemed deeper than the merely physical. His mother was still here. Sarabi, though Scar had never told him her name, had never confirmed their connection, and when he saw her from a distance, Something in the architecture of her face was familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with a feeling he had no name for. That night, unable to sleep, Simba descended to Scar's chambers, something he rarely did unprompted anymore, and he found his uncle awake, studying something by candlelight, a portrait, old and faded, of two young lions side by side. Scar looked up, and for just a moment something crossed his face, a flicker of something that might have been vulnerability or might have been calculation. "You should be resting," Scar said, and his voice carried the familiar tone of concern that Simba had learned to associate with love, though he was beginning to understand that concern and control are sometimes the same thing wearing different masks. "I wanted to ask you about the stampede," Simba said, and the words came out smaller and younger than he felt, a child's voice escaping from a body that was becoming a lion's. Scar set down the portrait and turned to face him fully, and Simba saw something shift in his uncle's bearing, a tightening of the shoulders that suggested this was a question Scar had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. "What about it?" Scar asked, his voice soft, which was somehow more dangerous than anger. "Nala said," Simba began, then stopped, watching Scar's expression harden around the edges. "Nala," Scar repeated, and each letter was careful, precise, like a thing being handled in the dark, "has been spreading stories about what happened that night. She said that Mufasa didn't die because of me," Simba said, and speaking the words aloud made them feel both more true and more impossible at the same time. Scar rose from his seat, and the candlelight caught the scar over his eye, throwing it into shadow, making it seem deeper and older and full of meaning. "Simba," he said, moving closer, and his voice held that texture of concern that had shaped so many of Simba's understandings of what love meant. "I have never lied to you." "You told me that I roared and caused the stampede," Simba said, and the words trembled slightly. "But I'm beginning to question whether I remember that correctly." What followed was not anger, which might have been easier to understand. What followed was a kind of patient, methodical dismantling that was so familiar to Simba that he almost didn't recognize it as a weapon. Scar reminded him of his loneliness in those first days in the darkness. He invoked the hunger that Simba's small body had endured. He spoke of all the ways that a cub, traumatized and alone, could convince himself of false things when there was no one else to confirm which memories were real. "I saved your life," Scar said, and his voice was low and even. "When I could have left you to die in that gorge, I brought you here, I fed you, I taught you. And this is how you repay me, by listening to the words of a lioness who barely knew your father, who has her own reasons to poison you against the truth." And the terrible thing was that Simba could not entirely refute this. He did not know if his memories were his or borrowed, real or planted. "Why would you keep me hidden if you truly wanted me to live?" Simba asked, and his voice cracked slightly. "Why not bring me back to the pride, to my mother, too?" "Because they were grief-stricken," Scar said. "Because introducing you would have torn the pride apart. Because I have been protecting you from a world that wanted you dead, a world that blamed you for your father's death, just as you blame yourself." Simba felt the weight of that settle over him like a physical thing, and he realized that this was the machinery of it, the way that Scar's control had never been about chains, but about confusion, about the precise, expert application of half-truths that bent around whatever grain of real guilt and real fear already existed in Simba's heart. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Simba whispered. Scar reached out and placed his paw against Simba's face, and his touch was gentle, almost tender, which was somehow the most devastating gesture of all. "Then believe in me," Scar said, "as you always have. I'm the only one who has ever truly understood you." And Simba stood there in the candlelit chamber, feeling the ground shift beneath him, caught between the version of himself that Scar had built, careful and obedient and bound, and the version that Nala's words had awakened, a version that was beginning to roar in the distance of his own mind, a roar he did not yet know how to answer. Later, alone in the darkness of the upper chambers, Simba found himself looking at the mural again, at the scar that marked his uncle's face in ochre paint. And for the first time, he understood that the mark was not a sign of strength, as Scar had always suggested, but evidence of something that had wounded him long before Simba was ever born. There is something about growing up bound by someone else's lies that the truth, when it comes, does not liberate you immediately. It fractures you first, splitting you into pieces that don't fit together the way they used to. Simba was beginning to live in that fracture, and he did not yet know that the confrontation that must come from it was already beginning to take shape, waiting for him in the spaces between who he had been told he was and who he was beginning to remember himself to be. In this week, the crisis week, as I've come to think of it, Scar understood for the first time what it truly meant to be losing grip on something you have seized with both claws and held with every ounce of will you possess. The first sign came not from above, but from below. Simba had begun to question him, gently at first, then with the careful insistence of a mind that had finally learned to doubt. When a captive starts to ask questions, the captor realizes that the chains have quietly transformed. They no longer bind the prisoner so much as they bind the keeper to the act of keeping. Above ground, matters were deteriorating in ways that no amount of theatrical pronouncement could conceal any more. The herds were gone, hunted to near extinction by the hyena clans Scar had invited into the Pride Lands to secure his throne. And now those same hyenas were turning toward the Pride itself, their hunger-growing teeth. Shenzi, the sharpest of the three lieutenants, began making demands. More territory, more guaranteed kills, more of everything Scar had promised in exchange for her loyalty. She did not threaten him outright. Scar still commanded fear through sheer psychological precision. But her tone had shifted, become less deferential, more transactional, a subtle withdrawal of the kind of obedience that keeps a regime standing. The other lions, starving and demoralized, were no longer merely accepting Scar's governance. They were beginning to endure it, a crucial distinction that Scar's intelligence was sharp enough to recognize immediately. Sarabi continued her silent refusal, would not acknowledge his orders, would not lower her eyes, would not give him the symbolic capitulation he craved more than he craved food. And somewhere in the rumor space between the stone walls and the whispers of the hungry, questions had begun to spread. What if the cub had not died in the stampede? What if the boy lived? I think about this moment often because it reveals something essential about the architecture of Scar's mind. He had built his entire kingdom on a single suppressed fact, and now that fact, dormant but alive, was beginning to stir like something waking in the dark. When Simba asked him directly, standing in the hidden chamber, the boy's voice carrying the first notes of genuine doubt, Scar did not panic. Instead, something sharper moved through him. The recognition that his masterwork, the thing he had crafted over 6 years in the darkness beneath the stone, was beginning to crack. He responded with what he had always used most effectively, not anger, but a kind of elegant cruelty dressed in the language of love. He reminded Simba of the gorge, of the stampede, of the hunger that had nearly claimed the boy before Scar's hand reached down to save him. He held the boy's face gently and spoke about the years of care, the food provided when the kingdom starved, the education and preparation for kingship that only he, Scar, could have offered. He painted Nala as a deceiver, a girl who had not suffered as they had, who knew nothing of the hard truths that ruled the world, whose interruption was an act of selfishness masquerading as rescue. All of this was delivered with the warmth of a father, the warmth that makes poison taste almost sweet. But I think what Scar did not fully understand, not yet, was that he had begun to exhaust the power of his own narrative. The boy's doubt, once awakened, could not be entirely re-narrated back to sleep. That same week, Scar made a choice that I believe marked the moment when desperation began to overtake calculation in his mind. He brought Simba above ground more frequently, showing him the ruined Pride Lands not as a consequence of Scar's misrule, but as proof of a harsh world that required harsh methods. The boy walked the ashen earth and saw the bones of the herds his uncle had destroyed, and Scar was there beside him, explaining it all away, reframing collapse as inevitability, starvation as discipline, death as the price of survival. But there was something new in Scar's manner, something that went beyond the careful manipulation of the previous years. There was an edge of anger beneath the sophistication, a tremor of genuine fear. When Simba suggested, hesitantly, that perhaps they could restore the herds, that perhaps there was another way, Scar's response was sharp enough to draw blood. Not physically, though his claws extended, but with words that stripped away some of the gentleness he had cultivated. The mask did not slip exactly, but it became translucent. You could see the machinery working underneath. What had always been Scar's strength, his ability to reframe reality, to make captivity sound like instruction and control sound like care, was beginning to fail him, not because the technique was flawed, but because the boy had finally glimpsed the truth behind it. And Scar, recognizing this, began to escalate. He tightened the food restrictions, not out of necessity, but as punishment for the boy's doubt, binding him more intensely through hunger and need. He began to spend hours in the chamber with Simba, monitoring him, hovering, oscillating between moments of calculated tenderness and sudden coldness, designed to keep the boy perpetually off balance. He brought Simba gifts, a piece of meat, a promise of a walk, only to withdraw them when the boy's loyalty seemed to waver, creating a rhythm of reward and deprivation that deepened the psychological dependence even as it made the dependence itself more visible, more fragile. Above ground, he became more openly paranoid, demanding that Shenzi increase surveillance of the pride, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that began to corrode even the transactional loyalty of the hyenas. He was, I think, beginning to understand that he had miscalculated the most fundamental thing, that a person raised in darkness might eventually yearn for light, and that no amount of narrative repositioning can entirely overcome that yearning once it has been awakened. What I find myself returning to, in thinking about this week, is the strange way that Scar's desperation revealed the exact shape of his vulnerability. He was a brilliant manipulator, yes, perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated predator we have ever documented in the Pride Lands. But he was also fundamentally brittle, because his entire architecture depended on perfect control, on the absolute unreality of an alternative narrative. The moment Simba began to genuinely doubt, the moment Shenzi began to question, the moment the pride began to whisper, Scar did not have a backup plan. He only had escalation. The deepest desperation often wears the mask of intensified control, and what Scar was doing in this week was showing us precisely how fragile his grip had become even as he tightened it with greater and greater force. There is something almost tragic in recognizing that the man who had orchestrated such a meticulous crime was now beginning to unravel because he could not accept that the person he had imprisoned might be developing a consciousness independent of his narrative. But tragedy, I think, requires some capacity for sympathy, and Scar had spent 6 years ensuring that sympathy was the one thing he had very carefully trained out of his captive son. Still, the stage was set. Simba's doubt had become real, Scar's control was beginning to visibly crack, and the Pride Lands themselves were collapsing under the weight of a regime built on unsustainable promises and fundamental lies. The storm came first, rolling across the Pride Lands like a judgment made visible, and with it came fire, spreading from the lightning strikes across the dry grass with a hunger that seemed personal, as if the land itself had decided it could no longer bear what had been done to it. Simba climbed toward Pride Rock through the smoke and the chaos, his body moving with a purpose his mind was still learning to accept, the roar that had come from Mufasa's ghost in the sky still echoing in the chambers of his chest. He did not know yet that he was going home. He only knew that something in him, something deeper than the years of conditioning, deeper than Scar's careful voice in the darkness, was calling him back to the place where he had lost himself. Scar waited at the summit, silhouetted against the burning sky, and when he saw Simba emerge through the smoke, his expression moved through shock and rage and something that looked almost like recognition, as if the man had been waiting his entire life for this moment without knowing it. There were no words between them at first, only the sound of the fire consuming the world below and the wind carrying ash across the stone, and then Scar spoke, quietly, with a gentleness that made the violence of it worse. "So you have come home." Simba's voice, when he answered, was steadier than it had been in 6 years, though it still carried the fracture lines of the boy who had been remade in darkness. "I came to stop you." Scar laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and said something that would live in Simba's memory forever. "Stop me. You are the one thing I made. You are mine, and you have always been mine. Even when you were beneath the rock in the dark, you were mine, and you knew it." The weight of those words, the truth and the lie twisted together so completely that Simba could not separate them, nearly broke him in that moment, nearly sent him backward into the old patterns of guilt and dependency, and the terrible, tender affection that Scar had cultivated with such care. But then Simba remembered something Nala had said in the chambers, remembered the painting of the lion and cub, remembered a fragment of a voice calling him "Little One" in the dark of the gorge before everything changed. And he understood that Scar's version of truth was not the only truth, that his years in captivity did not erase the life that had come before. He moved toward his uncle, not with certainty, but with the courage of someone moving despite uncertainty, and Scar rose to meet him, and the fight began. It was not a clean thing, not the kind of battle that stories make beautiful. It was a collision between a man clinging to power and a boy trying to remember who he was supposed to be, between the logic of the world Scar had built and the world that had existed before that logic took hold. Scar fought with the cunning that had kept him alive his whole life, feinting and circling, using the fire and the smoke as allies, blinding Simba and pressing him toward the edge of the stone where the drop waited like a promise. Simba fought with something that had no name yet, something that was part raw and part prayer, and though Scar was faster, though Scar had spent 6 years learning every weakness in the boy's psychology and exploiting it, there was something in Simba that Scar had never quite managed to kill, the memory of belonging to something larger than his uncle's love. They collided at the edge of Pride Rock, and for a moment Simba was pinned beneath Scar's weight, smoke in his eyes, the edge of the stone pressing against his back, and Scar's voice came down like a curse. "Tell me you killed him. Tell the lionesses. Say it." Simba, in that moment, gasping, bleeding, utterly certain he was going to die, chose to tell the truth instead. "No, you killed him. You killed my father." The admission broke something in Scar, or perhaps it revealed what had always been broken, and he hissed the confession back. "Yes, I killed Mufasa. I killed him so that you would be mine, so that there would be no other heir, no other claim, only you and me in the dark, and you would never doubt what I was." Even in his desperation, even in the moment of his admission, Scar could not stop the narcissism, could not stop reframing his crime as an act of devotion, and Simba, stronger now, younger now, with the force of a lion who had finally remembered his own name, threw him off. Scar rolled across the stone and pushed himself upright, and for a moment something flickered across his face that was not fury but something older and deeper. The fear of a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that he could control the world if he only controlled the story he told about it, and who was now watching that story collapse. He lunged at Simba one final time, his body moving with the desperation of a creature losing its grip, and Simba met him with a movement so instinctive, so purely himself, that it seemed to come not from training but from the very bone and blood of him. He caught his uncle midair, held him suspended for a moment that stretched like eternity, and then let gravity and momentum do what Simba himself could not quite bring himself to do. Scar fell from Pride Rock into the fire below, and Simba did not watch him land. He only stood at the edge of the stone, breathing like he had just been born, while above him the sky began to clear, and the rain began to fall, and he heard, distantly, as if from another life, the roar of the lionesses joining the battle, now that the truth was visible and their king was no longer a lie. He did not know yet what it would mean to wear Mufasa's throne, or how to undo the years of corruption, or how to govern a pride that had learned to accept cruelty as the natural order of things. He only knew in that moment that he was not Scar's son, that he had never been truly his, and that remembering who he was had been enough to survive remembering who his father was, and that survival itself, simple, terrifying enough, would have to be enough for now. The fire burns upward through the night, consuming Pride Rock from beneath, and Simba stands alone at the summit, breathing hard, feeling the heat rise against his face, and understanding for the first time that he has won something and lost almost everything in the same moment. Below him, the hyenas circle Scar's broken body, and their hunger, the same hunger that consumed the Pride Lands for 3 years, finds its final satisfaction. The man who promised them loyalty used them until they were no longer useful, and now they return the favor with the same casual cruelty he taught them. The lionesses are ascending the rock now, moving through the smoke, and Simba watches his mother emerge from the flames. Sarabi, who endured Scar's rule in silent defiance, whose dignity never bent even when her body was struck, and her son was hidden in darkness beneath her feet. There is no celebration in her face, only the exhaustion of survival and the terrible knowledge that the one child she thought dead has been alive all this time, imprisoned by the brother-in-law she was forced to live beside. Nala reaches him first, and when she touches him, Simba feels the weight of 6 years of separation, and 6 days of revelation collapse into a single moment that neither of them knows how to hold. Around them, the pride gathers. The lionesses who starved under Scar's rule, who ate after he ate, who learned to be small and silent and afraid. And they look at their new king with an expression that is not quite hope, because hope requires believing that things can change, and they have forgotten how to believe in change. The fire spreads outward now, consuming the dry grasses of the outer Pride Lands, and Simba understands with sudden clarity that the kingdom he has just claimed is not a kingdom at all but a skeleton, a monument to 3 years of deliberate devastation. I find myself thinking about what he must have felt in that moment. The physical exhaustion of the fight with Scar, yes, but deeper than that, a kind of psychological vertigo. The sudden, disorienting knowledge that the man who fed him in darkness, who shaped every thought in his mind, who claimed to love him, had engineered the destruction of everything he was supposed to inherit. Scar had told him, in their years of captivity, that the world outside the stone was dangerous, that his people were ungrateful, that his father's legacy was a tyranny disguised as nobility. And now Simba stood in the ruins of that taught contempt and saw that the only danger had been the man who spoke those words. Below ground, in the hidden chambers where Simba had spent 6 years, the darkness would soon fill with smoke and water as the fire raged above, and the rains began to fall. The place where his captivity had been lived out would be consumed, rendered uninhabitable, erased almost as thoroughly as Scar had tried to erase his identity. The irony is that Scar's defeat would accomplish what his control never could. It would destroy the physical evidence of the truth he had tried to bury, and the darkness beneath Pride Rock would become just another part of the legend that no living lioness had seen. Sarabi approaches her son now, and when she looks at him, Simba understands that she is seeing not the king he has just become, but the cub she lost, aged beyond his years, his eyes carrying knowledge they should never have carried. She does not know, yet, the full extent of what happened in those chambers, the careful work of psychological destruction, the slow replacement of his identity with a false one, the way Scar had spoken of love while teaching him to despise his father's memory. The telling of that would come later, in the quiet conversations that fathers and mothers have with children they have lost and found again, conversations filled with a kind of grief that is not about death, but about stolen time and stolen self. For now, she simply holds him, and Simba feels something inside him begin to crack, not the psychological architecture that Scar built, but the walls he has built around his own grief, the defenses that kept him functioning through years of captivity, and then through the terrible clarity of learning the truth all at once. The lionesses begin to move away from the fire now, descending Pride Rock, carrying with them the knowledge that the regime they lived under was built on a single, monstrous lie: that Simba was dead, that Scar was their rightful king, that their suffering was inevitable rather than engineered. But learning a truth does not erase the years it was hidden, and Simba, standing at the peak of the rock his father once ruled, understands that his first act as king is not to claim power, but to survey devastation. The herds have collapsed entirely, the grasses are ash, the water holes are dry, and the basic mechanisms of the circle of life that Mufasa had tried to teach him in what feels like another lifetime have been broken, disrupted, poisoned from within. It is not enough to defeat Scar, though that victory matters. Yes, it matters tremendously, because it is a defeat of the lie itself, the embodied falsification that had consumed everything he loved. But victory over a person is not the same as victory over the systems that person created, and Simba, as he stands there breathing the smoke and feeling the heat rise from the burning grasses below, is beginning to understand the scale of what he has inherited. He is, at that moment, a king in name only, a young lioness in his late adolescence, psychologically fractured by years of captivity, standing atop a burning rock, looking out over a kingdom that has been deliberately ruined, surrounded by people who are starving and afraid and processing their liberation all at once. The rain begins to fall then, heavy and cold, and it extinguishes the fire gradually, slowly, giving back the night as the flames retreat. And that too is part of the story, because in the logic of the Pride Lands, rain means restoration, means the circle turning again, means that the land itself is willing to forgive if those who live in it are willing to remember. But forgiveness and restoration are not the same thing, and as the rain falls and the fire dims and Simba stands breathing the cooled air of a world he must now learn to rule, I think about the cost that true victory demands. He has his identity back, yes. His name, his lineage, his father's legacy, all of it restored and confirmed. But the years of captivity cannot be unlearned, and the psychological patterns Scar spent 6 years weaving into his mind do not simply disappear because the weaver is dead. There is something there, in that threshold moment between the ending of one story and the beginning of another, that feels worth sitting with quietly. The knowledge that some victories are purchased at a price the victor will spend the rest of his life paying, and that kingship, true kingship, begins not with triumph, but with the terrible clarity of seeing exactly what has been broken and understanding that the work of healing is only beginning. When Simba's roar settled across the Pride Lands that first night, his voice still hoarse, still learning its own authority, the rain came down like an answer, washing ash from the stone and carrying the smell of the earth underneath, and he stood alone on the summit and felt the weight of what he had inherited begin to settle onto his shoulders. The next morning, Rafiki came up the rock path, moving slowly, his staff tapping against the stone, and when he reached the king he did not speak at all, but simply took Simba's face in his weathered hands and looked at him, really looked at him, as though seeing him for the first time, or perhaps the first time since he was a cub. There's something I think about a lot in how kingship arrives not as a moment of triumph, but as a slow, heavy comprehension. Simba stood at the edge of Pride Rock, and understood, truly, that the Pride Lands he had inherited were not a kingdom, but a graveyard. The herds had not returned with the first rain. The prey had been hunted so thoroughly, so without mercy or limit, that what remained were only scattered animals, wary and thin, moving in fragments rather than in the organized abundance his father had taught him to expect. The lionesses came to him in the days after, and Sarabi walked first, her face marked by 6 years of captivity and resistance, her eyes still carrying the weight of Scar's hand across her face. And when she bowed to her son, something in Simba broke open because he had been a captive too, and she had been captive above while he was captive below, and neither of them had been able to save the other. Nala stood beside him, had stood beside him from the moment he roared, and he found that he could not quite look at her without feeling the strange geometry of gratitude and guilt that had defined so much of his life. She had saved him by finding him, but he had only been found because she had risked everything, and the debt of that sat between them like something living. Zazu emerged from his cage, and I want to pause here, because the image of the majordomo stepping out into daylight after years of imprisonment is its own small reckoning, and bowed so formally, so precisely, that Simba understood. There was still a structure underneath the ruin. There were still people who remembered what the kingdom had been. There were still voices that could teach him what he needed to know. His mother brought him to the council chamber, what remained of it, and together they stood in the dimness, and she told him slowly what Scar had done, not just the large story of the stampede and the lies, but the smaller, more intimate destructions. How he had forbidden the name of Mufasa to be spoken, how he had allowed the hyenas to hunt without limit, how he had struck her in front of the pride to demonstrate what defiance would cost. Sarabi's voice did not waver as she spoke, but Simba watched her hands. They were trembling, and understood that the cost of her resistance had been paid in small violences every day, that she had been strong in ways he was only beginning to comprehend, and that his own captivity, terrible as it was, had been only one expression of Scar's need to control every living thing beneath his rule. In the first week, Simba attempted to order the herds to return, and they did not. The prey had learned that Pride Rock was a place of death, that the grasslands near the rock were stripped bare, that the lionesses themselves were unpredictable in their hunger because they had been starving, and the animals had learned something that Simba had not yet learned. That trust, once broken, does not return simply because a new voice is calling. He walked the perimeter of the Pride lands with Zazu, who pointed out the places where the erosion had become visible, where the bones of dead creatures lay scattered and bleached, where the vegetation had been eaten down to the root and could not regenerate, and Simba felt something like vertigo because the scale of the destruction was not abstract. It was specific and visible, and everywhere he looked. There was a moment, standing in what had been the northern grazing ground, where Simba found himself thinking about Scar in a way that surprised him. His uncle had not simply murdered the kingdom, he had murdered it with intention, had understood precisely what he was destroying and had chosen the destruction anyway, had looked at his brother's philosophy of the circle of life and decided instead to break the circle entirely. And that's the thing about inheriting ruin, I think. It's not enough to simply be better than the person who came before, because being better is the baseline, is the nothing from which you must build. What Simba had to do was not simply stop the cruelty, but actively reverse it, had to become a gardener in a landscape that had been deliberately salted, had to teach a pride that had learned to survive through submission to remember that they could thrive instead. The lionesses were the anchor point because they had survived, and because they had begun to resist even before Simba returned. Sarabi's quiet defiance had been a constant, and the younger lionesses had learned from her that compliance was not the only option, and when Simba began to restore the old structures of governance, asking for their counsel rather than demanding it, something in the pride began to shift toward him. Nala moved into the role of queen not because it was given to her, but because she had already claimed it in the work of rescue, and because Simba, still learning what it meant to be king, recognized that he needed someone beside him who understood both who he had been and who he needed to become, and the weight of partnership was different from the weight of loneliness, even if it was still heavy. The hyenas, with Scar dead, had fractured and dispersed. Some had moved beyond the borders of the Pride lands entirely. Others had consolidated into smaller packs that remained, but no longer hunted with the systematic cruelty that had characterized their time as enforcers. And this dispersal created its own set of problems, because a predator without order is unpredictable, and the Pride lands had to learn to live with predation again. Not the controlled nightmare of Scar's era, but the complicated reality of the circle of life that Mufasa had taught was the way of things. Simba would find himself standing at the edge of the stone and thinking about Mufasa's voice, the lessons that had been spoken to him when he was very young and had seemed simple then, but which now carried dimensions he had not understood. That a king was not a ruler but a shepherd, that the land's health was inseparable from the pride's health, that the circle of life was not a metaphor for authority, but a description of actual interconnection. There was a night, perhaps 3 weeks after the coronation, when Simba woke in the chamber where Mufasa had once slept and realized that he could not remember the exact sound of his father's voice. And the panic that seized him was profound, because he had been captive to another voice for so long that his father's voice had been overwritten. And he understood in that moment that Scar's greatest achievement had not been his rule, but his capacity to erase, to rewrite, to make people doubt the evidence of their own memory. He spoke with Zazu for hours that night, asking the majordomo to tell him again what Mufasa had been like, what he had valued, how he had ruled, and Zazu's voice as he spoke carried something like grief, because the majordomo had loved the old king in his own way, had served faithfully, and had been imprisoned for his faithfulness, and his testimony became for Simba a kind of restoration, not the exact return of his father's voice, but something like a handhold, a place to stand while learning to walk as king. Rain fell often in those first weeks, which Rafiki said was the land answering, was the natural order reasserting itself, and Simba wanted to believe that kingship was simply a matter of being in the right place, and the land would respond. But the practical work was slower and more laborious. It was learning which fields could be allowed to lie fallow, where water should be directed, how many of the lionesses could hunt successfully in their current state of recovery, how to teach a pride that had been broken to believe again in abundance. There were nights when Simba would return to the chambers beneath Pride Rock, the place where he had been captive, and he would stand in the darkness and feel its weight. And he did not yet know, in those early weeks, that this reckoning with his own history would be ongoing, would not resolve into simple recovery, but would instead become a presence he would carry, a part of how he governed, a knowing written into his bones that kingdoms can be broken and must be actively, patiently, courageously remade. As the season turned, and the visible world began, slowly, to show signs of recovery, new grass pushing through ash, prey beginning to move more freely, the lionesses growing stronger as food became more abundant, Simba found himself thinking about something his father had never had to teach him. How to rule not from certainty, but from the difficult work of building trust after it has been shattered. How to be a king not because he had been raised to it, but because he had survived the effort to destroy that possibility. There is a moment, I think, that comes to every person who has survived something that they were not supposed to survive, when the sheer fact of still being alive begins to feel almost improbable. Simba, standing in the green returning to the Pride Lands, his mane darkening with the season's rains, understood this in a way that words could never quite contain. Around him, the kingdom was healing, slowly, with the patience of root systems that must first remember how to reach downward before they can grow upward again. The herds came back first, cautiously, as if they too were uncertain whether the land that had starved them had truly transformed. The grass followed, spreading from the hidden places where Scar's hyenas had not yet reached, green spreading like memory returning to cleared ground. And yet, as Simba walked through this renewal that he himself had made possible, he carried with him something that no amount of rain could wash away. The echo of the chambers beneath Pride Rock, the darkness that had shaped him during the years when the world above was burning. I think about what it means, the weight of remembering who you are supposed to be after spending years being taught who you were not. Simba had done what his father's father before him could not. He had broken the cycle that Scar had tried to cement into the very stone of Pride Rock itself. He had chosen to reign with the wisdom of the circle of life, not because the philosophy came naturally to him, but because he had seen what happened when a king chose instead to reign through cruelty, through hunger, through the deliberate breaking of those under his care. That choice cost him something that cannot be easily named, the luxury of forgetting. In the early reigns of his second season as king, Simba would sometimes find himself in the hidden chambers below the rock, the very chambers where Scar had kept him in deliberate darkness. He did not go there in anger, nor with the intention of mourning what he had lost, though there was loss there, certainly. The childhood he should have had, the time with his father that the stampede had stolen, the simple, uncomplicated love that most young lions take for granted. He went there because it was still part of him, and a king who pretends that the dark places within his kingdom do not exist is a king who permits darkness to breed undisturbed. The lionesses, watching him descend into those chambers, did not follow, though Sarabi watched from a distance with an expression that suggested she understood something of what her son was carrying beneath his new authority. She had survived Scar's hand raised against her, had watched her kingdom collapse into ash, had held the memory of Mufasa alive through silent resistance when even speaking his name was forbidden. She and Simba rarely spoke of these things directly, but they inhabited the same weight of knowledge, that a kingdom rebuilt is not the same as a kingdom that was never broken. Above ground, the work of restoration was visible and tangible, the kind of work that a young king could point to and say, "This is what I have done." Herds migrated back to grasslands that had turned green again. The smell of moisture returned to soil that had been dust. The hyenas, those fractured remnants that lingered at the borderlands, gradually learned that the kingdom was no longer a place where their hunger was invited to feast without limit. But the other work, the work of gathering up the fragmented pieces of Simba's own mind, the work of learning to trust his own memory against the voice of a man who had spent years convincing him that he could not trust anything at all, that work was quieter, and it would not be finished in a season or in 5 seasons or perhaps in a lifetime. There were nights when Simba would dream of the stampede, and in the dream he would hear his own voice roaring and feel the earth collapse beneath him, and he would wake, his breath sharp, his heart hammering, and for a moment, suspended in the darkness, he would not be certain whether he was remembering truth or the beautiful, terrible lie that Scar had woven into his earliest, most fragile memories. In those moments, Nala would be beside him, and her presence alone was sometimes enough, not to erase the confusion, but to remind him that there were voices in the world beyond the one voice that had defined him for so long. She did not speak much of the past in those quiet hours, did not press him to explain or to prove that he was healing. She had learned, I think, during the long days of searching for the friend she had lost, and the shock of finding him transformed into something both familiar and strange, that healing is not a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It is a process of becoming gradually more comfortable with the idea that you contain multiple truths at once, that you are both the child who was deceived and the king who now knows the truth, that you are both broken and capable of leading, that the scars of your past are not erasable but can become, over time, something other than wounds. In the evenings, Simba would stand with his daughter Kiara on the stone overlooking the restored kingdom, and he would begin to speak, as his father had spoken to him before the stampede, about the circle of life and the way that all living things are connected through the great turning of seasons and death and birth. But his voice would sometimes falter, and Kiara would look at him with a child's puzzlement, and he would have to remember that his wounds were not her wounds, that he could not protect her by teaching her his fear, that the truest thing he could give her was not a kingdom without danger, but a kingdom where danger did not disguise itself as love. This was perhaps the deepest cost of what had been done to him in those years beneath the stone, that he could never again believe that cruelty and care were strangers to each other, that a person could not offer you food with one paw while breaking your spirit with the other, that the face of the person who harmed you could not also be the only face in the world that seemed to offer you understanding. Learning to be king meant learning, day by day, to rebuild the part of himself that Scar had been so careful to dismantle, the capacity to trust his own judgment, the belief that love did not have to carry the weight of debt and damage, the understanding that a father's guidance could be firm without being cruel, could be honest about danger without using danger as a tool of control. These were small recognitions, really, not the sort of thing that would appear in the histories of his reign or be sung about in the stories the Pride would tell. But they were the foundation upon which everything else was built. And as the seasons turned, and the Pride lands grew greener, and his daughter grew taller beside him, Simba understood, with a kind of quiet certainty, that the work of healing was not a destination he would reach, but a path he would walk, slowly, carefully, with setbacks and surprising moments of peace, with nights when he would still wake uncertain and days when he would still hear the echo of that voice beneath the stone, telling him that he could not trust what he remembered, that he was responsible for the darkness, that he belonged to the darkness. But he would wake, and he would stand, and he would walk out into the light of the kingdom he had claimed, and he would remember that remembering is itself a kind of victory, and that a king who is broken and knows himself to be broken is sometimes wiser, sometimes more merciful than a king who has never had to question whether the truth he was told was true. The scars would remain, but the Pride Lands was green. Years have passed since the night Simba stood atop Pride Rock and roared as the rightful king, and I find myself thinking about what comes after victory in ways I did not expect to. The herds have returned to the Pride Lands. The grass spreads green across what was, not so long ago, a wasteland of ash and bone. The circle of life has begun to turn again, and Simba has learned, through the long seasons of his kingship, to let it turn without the grip of fear that nearly strangled him in those early months. But there is something I want to sit with before we close this story, because the real weight of what Simba did, what he became, was not in the moment he defeated Scar, but in every moment that followed. It was in the choices he made, when no one was watching. Sarabi, his mother, had lived through 6 years of a tyrant's rule, while her son lived in darkness beneath the stone, and when she saw him emerge into the light as a young man, it was not vindication she felt first, but a kind of ache that no victory could quite erase. She had raised him knowing that one day he would be king, teaching him the traditions and the weight of the crown, and then watched as that crown was stolen by the one man in the pride she had learned to despise. When she stood beside him at the summit after his victory, she did not weep for relief alone. She wept for the years that had been taken, and for the boy who had been remade in captivity, and for the knowledge that kingship would now ask him to rebuild what his uncle had deliberately destroyed. In the months that followed his coronation, Simba did something that his father had never needed to do, and that Scar had never tried to do. He went into the hidden chambers beneath Pride Rock and stood in the darkness where he had spent his childhood. He did not seal them, as many of his advisers urged him to do. He did not forget them, though forgetting would have been easier. Instead, he brought light into them, torches, and the simple illumination of a lion who had learned that denial does not heal, it only postpones the wound. And standing in those chambers, Simba confronted something that victory had not resolved. The fact that he carried within him both the son Scar had tried to create and the heir that Mufasa had believed him to be. This is the thing that I think people often miss about breaking cycles. It is not enough to defeat the person who perpetuated it. You must reckon with the parts of you that internalized their lessons, that learned to survive through their methods, that bore their mark in ways you cannot simply put down. Simba understood this. He understood that when he told his daughter Kiara about the circle of life, about the balance and the beauty of the natural world, there was a voice inside him, faint now, but never entirely silent, that whispered Scar's version. That gentleness was weakness, that love was a tool for manipulation, that trust was another word for vulnerability. And Simba refused to let that voice teach his daughter. This refusal was not simple, and it was not achieved through strength alone. It was achieved through the patience of sitting beside Nala on cool nights and listening as she spoke about what she remembered of Mufasa, of his true character, of the kind of king he had been and the kind of king Simba was becoming. It was achieved through the presence of Rafiki, who understood that the shaman's role in the aftermath of such violation was not to declare healing complete, but to witness the long, unglamorous work of becoming whole. It was achieved through Simba's own willingness to let himself be wrong, to doubt his own judgments, to ask the lionesses of the pride for counsel and accept it, a humility that Scar, despite all his intelligence, had never possessed. In the second year of his kingship, when herds had returned and the land had begun to bloom again, Simba made a decision that revealed how deeply he understood the nature of cycles. There were lions in the pride, not hyenas, but lions, who had been part of Scar's regime, who had benefited from his cruelty or participated in it through cowardice or hunger-driven desperation. Some advisors urged their exile or their execution, seeing them as contaminated by association. But Simba, who had himself been contaminated by captivity, understood that banishment without mercy was only another way of perpetuating Scar's logic, that separation was safety, that exile was justice, that the marked could never be unmarked. Instead, he offered something rarer and more difficult, a choice. He told them the truth of what had happened beneath Pride Rock and what had happened to the Pride lands because of it. He told them that he had been taught to believe lies, and that he understood how easy it was to believe lies when you were hungry or afraid or in the dark. And he told them that they could stay, but only if they chose to stay as part of the circle, not as subjects of a king, but as participants in a kingdom that belonged to all of them. Some left, unable to bear the mirror that truth held to their own complicity. Some stayed, and their staying was a kind of reckoning with themselves. But here is what mattered. Simba did not force them to stay, and he did not drive them out with the singular rage that a man shaped only by victimhood might have chosen. He offered them the thing that had been withheld from him in the darkness, a choice that was genuinely theirs to make. Years into his reign, when Kiara was born and Rafiki presented her at Pride Rock, in the ceremony that echoes back to Simba's own birth in a time that must have felt to him like another lifetime, Simba held his daughter and felt the weight of generations in his arms. He understood, in a way that Mufasa could not have predicted, that the real test of kingship was not in the grand gestures or the roar that carried across the land. It was in the small choices, the patience with which he answered Kiara's endless questions, the gentleness with which he corrected her, the vulnerability with which he sometimes told her about her grandfather Mufasa, and let himself weep for the father he had lost before he could truly know him. This is the breaking of the cycle. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain become the foundation of how you treat those who come after you. Not the erasure of trauma, but the transformation of it into wisdom. And in those years after Simba's victory, as the Pride lands healed and the next generation grew, something shifted in the deep places of what the Pride meant and how it lived. The shadow that Scar had cast, long, calculated, poisonous, began to fade not because it was forgotten, but because it was integrated into a larger story. The story of a young prince who was remade in darkness, but chose, when given the chance, to remake himself in light. The story of a king who understood that the circle of life was not a metaphor or a philosophy, but a choice made again and again in every generation by lions who could have perpetuated cruelty but chose instead to break it. And so the circle turns unbroken,